Hello everyone, welcome into another stream. Hope you're all doing well. I'm doing pretty well myself. Just running a little bit behind, but it's all good. So, who did we even watch yesterday? Usually I double check before I go live, because I tend to forget what we did. Alright, yeah. So yesterday we looked at Elden Ring Lore, The Great Works Part 1, based off of the psychology of Carl Jung by the Center Tarnished. Then we watched a short video by Mindspatch, a member of the community, Lorebites, Gavlan the Gurm. Then we finished off with one video by Max the Rat, which it was Alchemy Explained So Much About Elden Ring's Story, America Secret Revealed. We didn't go through his next video that was on the list, but that's fine. We'll probably get to it maybe tomorrow. I'm thinking maybe of looking at more alchemy stuff on tomorrow's stream, because we have Max the Rat and Crunchy having a couple of videos about that, so it seems like it would be maybe a smart idea to just kind of keep them all grouped together, so that way we get an alchemy lore blast. So yeah. Mortis, Mercy, nice to see you guys. Necropolis, welcome on in. So today we're going to look into 3 videos total. We might run a bit over time because I'm sure I'm going to have a lot to talk about. So the first video will be the 3 Creeds of the Erdtree by the Tarnished Archaeologist. The next one will then be Elden Ring Lore, Melina, and Identity Crisis by the Ashen Hollow. And then finally we will get to Elden Ring Lore, The Secrets of the Erdtree by Ziostorm. So, as I had mentioned in yesterday's stream, I have been catching up with the Tarnished Archaeologist's playlist on my free time. I actually have watched this video, and I do have a lot of notes about it, and there's going to be a lot that I'm going to talk about it in general, because this video, compared to his other ones, I found to be really problematic in a multitude of ways. So I kind of intend to cover a lot of the problems I was having with this video specifically, and in a more broader sense, perhaps the approach that the Tarnished Archaeologist has been taking to lore, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I do feel like this kind of direct criticism and feedback can be valuable in helping a channel grow in the future. So that's kind of my hope for going through this. Hey, Astenex and Methoda, nice to see you guys again. From the new Vati premiere? No, I didn't even know he had one. Alright. So, first we'll go into the 3 Creeds of the Erdtree by the Tarnished Archaeologist. Let's go ahead and dive on in. I may as well read this out loud for anybody who's just listening along. We have a quote even from Isaac Newton, which says, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." Let me know how the volume is for you guys.
The religious historian Bart Ehrman has a nice way of framing the earliest history of Christianity by asking his students, how did Christianity go from being the religion taught by Jesus to a religion taught about Jesus? What he means by that didactic question is that, based on the earliest writings we have about Jesus, which are found within the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the teachings of Jesus differ quite a bit from the eventual religion that sprung up around him after his death and purported resurrection. To take one example, Jesus, based on the Synoptic Gospels, never called himself the Son of God, never called himself divine, and certainly never said that he was the equal of God. Instead, he taught about the coming apocalypse and how people should live in the remaining time they had in order to be admitted into heaven. We here at Tarnished Archaeology are not going to weigh in on the merits of those shifts, but clearly, just how early Christianity went from being a religion centered on the teachings of a Jewish apocalyptic preacher and the coming end of the world, to a religion entirely constructed around the divinity of Jesus himself and the miracle of his resurrection, is one of the critical ideological innovations in all of world history. Although in some ways it is not that unusual. In fact, religious symbols and figures are rarely revered as divine in their own time. Usually many generations pass before the full divine mythology coalesces. Countless Catholic saints have been canonized posthumously, and the traditional biographies of the Prophet Muhammad and Siddhartha Gautama were all written centuries after their respective deaths.
Yeah, so I really like that kind of a real-life lore parallel here, and I'm going to go ahead and say it a bit directly now, that while I really do value these kind of comparisons, I do think Tarnished Archaeologist gets a little bit ahead of himself in this video by taking the lens of the posthumous Jesus allegory and trying to fit Elden Ring into it. And while that might work depending on like how you frame things, I do think he gets a couple things wrong later on, which I'll address when we get to. And everybody else who's been joining, welcome in. Too many names to list off. Magister Ludi's been loving the reactions. You finally got a PS4 and you're playing Bloodborne again for the first time in ages. My vids have made the cryptic lore much more digestible, so huge thanks. Well, yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that they make it more digestible, yeah. Alright, going back to the video.
Allowing plenty of time for mythology to develop. And that should not be so surprising. After all, it is easier to mythologize something in its absence than it is to deal with the difficult realities of the flesh and blood. But what if the divine symbol of your religion is not a person, but an object? A tree, for example. In Elden Ring, this pattern of posthumous deification is maintained not only with Marika, who, though undoubtedly worshipped in her own time, has become an even more omnipresent symbol since her imprisonment. Indeed, that is why her most common symbol, seen in the churches of Marika, is actually of her imprisoned pose. But so too the Erdtree, that towering symbol of life-giving power of the Elden Ring, became an object of faith after it was gone, the devoutness of its followers only growing in its absence. Here,
and this is where I would have my first major disagreement with him, but I'll wait for him to kind of build this idea up a bit more before I try to break it down, metaphorically speaking here.
Is the story of the first burning of the Erdtree and the evolution of faith in the lands between.
Chapter 1, The Age of Plenty.
The first burning of the Erdtree is a topic we've touched upon before, in our very first video in fact, so it's about time we update some things here. To begin with, multiple items attest to a bygone era of abundance, known as the Erdtree's Age of Plenty. We'll leave a full discussion of the incantations for later on in the video, so here we'll just mention the blessing of the Erdtree incantation, which reads, quote, "The Erdtree once flourished with abundance, yet it was only for a fleeting moment. Such is the course of all life," end quote, clearly indicating the ephemeral nature of this age of abundance. And the Blessed Dew Talisman tells us, quote, "It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith," end quote. The icon of this Age of Plenty is the Erdtree relief, seen on Marika's bedchamber and the Erdtree sanctuary, where, if you look closely, you can actually see the blessed sap dripping from the boughs of the Erdtree. But again, the talisman's description makes it clear that that age has long gone. This Age of Plenty was apparently during Godfrey's reign, as the Crimson Amber medallion reads, quote, "The Erdtree's old sap becomes amber, treasured as the most precious of jewels in the age of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord." End quote. These days, the blessed dew no longer falls from the Erdtree itself, but rather is collected from the minor Erdtrees. The flask of...
I do like the auto subs there, that the blessed doom. Yeah, so Jube, welcome back into the stream. I'm sorry your phone is giving you some issues typing. And DQ Din, welcome into the stream for the first time, I believe. You said, where do these lore masters get their sources from? Did they live in the lands between? I mean, obviously you're joking, but I do think that is a good question. And to just treat it a bit more straightforwardly, most people will get their lore sources from like item descriptions or archaeological findings in the game and stuff like that. However, I do think it's important to denote what is a person's speculation versus what is coming from the text directly. So that way people don't get confused about the basic facts of the game when they talk to others. Because it's really easy to forget where like sources come from. And obviously people are going to like forget what's speculation versus what's fact, but I just think it's a better practice in general. So yeah, yeah, the blessed doom. Jube, I have no idea what you're trying to say, man. All right. So the other things that I wanted to talk about in the video so far is I do kind of agree with the idea that on the Erdtree Sanctuary, you could make the argument that like that depiction of the Erdtree right there could correspond to the one during the Age of the Abundance, because you could like see the sap coming from it and stuff. But there's going to be some more questionable statements he does make about the Erdtrees later on in this video, I think. Otherwise, it might have been in some of his previous videos. But one issue that I've been having with Tarnished Archaeologist in general is I've noticed that they have a pattern of referring to things that they've talked about in previous videos, which is perfectly fine because you can't necessarily rehash everything you talked about in a previous video. I totally understand that. However, I do think these videos suffer by the way Tarnished Archaeologist approaches that, because they're very rarely self-contained, where they don't extrapolate from previous videos that Tarnished Archaeologist has made. So it kind of makes it a lot harder to follow along, especially if you're coming into a later episode in the series that's not exactly labeled as a series, I guess. So that is something I have become more cognizant of very recently, and I'm going to address some more stuff that goes along with that in the future.
Erdtree itself, but rather is collected from the minor Erdtrees. The flask of wondrous physic reads, quote, "A relic of the physic chemists, priests of the Erdtree, harnesses the power of crystal tears which form after the passage of many moons. Basins are placed at the feet of minor Erdtrees throughout the lands between." End quote. And finally, the Crimson Seed Talisman tells us that, quote, "The Erdtree was once perfect and eternal, and thus it was believed that Erdtree seeds could not exist." End quote. So, to summarize, there was an Age of Plenty during the reign of Godfrey, and during which blessed, life-giving sap dripped from the Erdtree, which was collected and used in a very specific ritual in Leyndell. But don't even get us started on that one. This Age of Plenty swiftly came to a close for some as of yet unstated reason, and during this time of crisis, the Erdtree produced seeds, something which was once thought impossible, and now its progeny, the minor Erdtrees, are the only sap producers left in the lands between.
So he doesn't say, I mean, obviously I cut him off here. He does tend to have a couple, actually a lot of run-on sentences, which makes it a little bit harder to go with the flow and follow his train of thought sometimes. But I do believe he is conflating the shattering with this event, and I will explain about that a lot more in detail later. And the bigger issue that I have with this style of presentation is just how matter of factly the Tarnished Archaeologist is presenting this information, when I would argue there's an abundance of information which can go ahead and contradict his claims. So just to let him finish his thoughts here, hopefully, and I'll address them a bit more point by point.
Zealously guarded by the avatars that sprung up with them. These guardians, the avatars of the Erdtree itself, take the form of a destroyed root stump, symbolism that will not be lost on regular viewers of the channel.
So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where they constantly reference their previous work, which is fine to a degree, but I've found they kind of make these sweeping implications that aren't outright stated, which kind of oddly gives them this weird plausible deniability about what they're saying at times, and it becomes really difficult to pin down what they're stating to be a fact versus what they're kind of insinuating as their own speculation, which I think is going to be continually problematic as we move forward here. And as more lore just came into the stream and said, don't the seeds come from the shattering? Isn't that what the game literally says? You're correct. And that is the implication of what Tarnished Archaeologist is saying here, although it hasn't been stated outright. So you're wondering whether or not the Tarnished Archaeologist is trying to say that the shattering happened at the end of the Age of Abundance. Spoiler alert, I actually have watched this video, and the answer is yes, which is very unintuitive, and I do think there's other things which go along with this that I don't believe the Tarnished Archaeologist has fully considered in their view of the timeline. And Body has had the same issue? Yeah, okay.
And in fact, we do know a bit more about what this crisis actually was, as the Golden Seed description tells us that, quote, when the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erdtree, scattering across the various lands, as if life itself knew that its end had come, end quote. So evidently, the catastrophe that brought about the end of the Age of Plenty was indeed contemporaneous with the shattering of the Elden Ring. And the Erdtree's response to this crisis, prematurely producing and scattering its seeds in a time of stress, is indeed what many plants actually do. As pointed out by one of our astute viewers, this process...
So again, this kind of goes into the run-on sentences, so I don't mean to cut him off mid-thought there, but yes, that is kind of the first time that he's saying, slightly indirectly here, that the shattering immediately followed the Age of Abundance, which I think is contrary to a lot of other things in the lore, and I will continue to let them make some more points before we break that down point by point.
Process is called bolting, and is a common response of plants to stress. They produce seeds prematurely in a desperate attempt to save their lineage, if perhaps not the individual plant itself.
And again, I really, really enjoy those kind of real life parallels that the Tarnished Archaeologist brings in relation to the game. However, a consequence of that is I think it tends to distract people from the point that they were originally making, and it kind of gives them a false sense of authority about the claims that they make about the game text. Whereas I would say they might have a bit more authority on the real life parallels, but they don't necessarily directly tie into game as often as they may make it appear.
All pretty straightforward stuff so far, but we'll need to discuss the burning of the Erdtree. The primary forensic evidence for the first burning of the Erdtree comes from the city of Lanedale itself. The light of the Erdtree was once a glorious beacon of light for the lands between, but is now a golden siren song, as the city at its base has fallen into disarray and despair. Soldiers abandon their posts, misbegotten hack soldiers to pieces just outside the rampart gate. The queen's bedchamber is empty, and most conspicuously of all, a thick layer of ash covers the entire city.
I don't remember if those misbegotten are actually hacking down soldiers specifically, or if they're just like nondescript corpses. I should have like double checked that before the stream, but I apologize, I did not. So I'll just give him the benefit of the doubt for now for that one.
The ash is such a catastrophe that the residents of both Upper and Lower Lanedell have taken to sealing their doors and windows with wax. A strategy almost identical to that used in the American Dust Bowl, when residents would use tar paper, if they could afford it, which is basically just paper saturated with tar, the remnants of decaying organic material, to seal their windows and stave off the incessant dust. Lanedell, to put it simply, is a post-apocalyptic wasteland, but not everyone knows it yet. We've heard some arguments that perhaps this ash is from Grandsax's decaying corpse or some other source, so let's do a little bit of investigation. First of all, the ash is found throughout the city, in both Upper and Lower Lanedell, including in points of high elevation, like near America's Bedchamber, or the eastern rampart of the city, very far away from where Grandsax is. In no way is it concentrated or localized to just where Grandsax is. It's not like we see a layer of ash in Farum or other places with dragons. Instead, we specifically see it covering the city of Lanedell. Second,
So I think that point right there is a little bit of a false equivalency, although I kind of understand why they're trying to say that the ash didn't come from Grandsax, like the corpse of it specifically, but I think that's kind of misrepresenting what might be other people's... Uh-oh. Alright, internet is okay, hopefully? Okay, so I think that might be unintentionally misrepresenting other people's beliefs that... Okay, internet issues, if I could say the sentence. So I think the issue is that Grandsax may have burned either Lanedell or part of the Erdtree slightly, and you could make the argument that the ash comes from that. But even if it doesn't, we do have...
in
the fortified manor here has very clear char marks compared to all the other parts of Lanedell. So it might be possible the ash came from an earlier period. Oh man. Okay. So I am having internet difficulties. I will go ahead and upload this in its entirety to the main section of my channel, and that won't have any cutouts. But I will kind of continue as we go along. Upload to the main section of my channel after this. Okay. Alright, so my apologies for the kind of technical difficulties for the people watching live. Nah, my stream is glitching a little bit, Mortis, but thanks. You do think the tree was burnt before with Melina's ghost already having burned her hands, which you think is telling she burnt the tree before? Yeah, there are multiple ways you could potentially describe the Erdtree being burned, and I think the argument here that it came from like the body of Grandsax is a little bit disingenuous, but we've kind of made that point, so let's just listen to the Tarnished Archaeologist's next one.
It's not like we see a layer of ash in Farum or other places with dragons. Instead, we specifically see it covering the city of Lanedell. Second, in the end of the game, of course, we burn down the Erdtree and produce another wave of ash, literally transforming the city into a, quote, capital of ash, end quote. So it should be no mystery as to where the ash comes from. And finally, in the Mending Rune cutscenes, we can see that the ash created from our burning still lingers, though we've regenerated the Phantom Erdtree. We'll return to these cutscenes in a bit, but for now, just think about the state of the world after these Mending Rune endings.
So, I don't disagree with the kind of conclusion that they're making that ash most likely came from the Erdtree. I'm fine with that. However, that says absolutely nothing about the time when it was burned, which is going to be critical in understanding the Tarnished Archaeologist's later points.
There is an Erdtree, yes, because its spectral form, what one of our very astute viewers has called a phantom instead of an illusion, has been regenerated by mending the Elden Ring, but the ash lingers in the capital for all to see. In other words, it's exactly what we find when we enter Leyndell the very first time, evidence of a prior burning and regeneration. Miyazaki has long been a fan of cycles, fire and dark, hollowing and restoring humanity, the pre-human civilizations of Bloodborne. And here is Elden Ring's core cycle, the burning and regeneration of the Erdtree. And we, the Tarnished of No Renown, are by no means the first to do it. For context, breaking the cycle, a deeply Buddhist notion close to Miyazaki's heart, can occur in only one of two ways. Either we don't regenerate the Erdtree at all, as in Ranni's ending, or we so catastrophically burn it that there is nothing left to regenerate, as in the Frenzied Flame ending. Notice also how in the Frenzied Flame ending there is just the physical stump left, basically that which preceded the Erdtree, the remaining physical portion that remains after the Phantom Erdtree has been consumed by the Frenzied Flame.
So, I kind of appreciate that observation, although I don't necessarily agree with it. I do understand why you could come to that conclusion, because it's not like you see the other portion of the Erdtree like fallen here before. However, I do think this kind of claim brings up some interesting points, and for the record, the idea of the Erdtree being a phantom Erdtree isn't exactly wrong, but it might be a little misleading, because in English, to me at least, the idea of something being a phantom means that it could have connotations that the thing doesn't necessarily exist. So I think if you just like type in phantom to like Google or whatnot, so you have a ghost, and then literally the second definition is a figment of the imagination, but that doesn't necessarily mean that. So I think ghost is kind of what the Tarnished Archaeologist is trying to, well, I don't want to say that they're trying to imply that. It's just a little, I almost feel like they're trying to say like the opposite, that it doesn't exist. But like I said before, I think that's misleading. And I would probably be more on board with the idea of it being a quote unquote phantom if when we burned the Erdtree, the golden tree, the upper portion wasn't burning as well. So it's not like only this part burns. So at the very least, it represents that it's something more metaphysical to me. And as I've mentioned before on my previous streams, the whole idea of it being illusory is also a kind of unfortunate artifact of localization. And I would make the argument that incorporeal may have been the better way to localize it into English. And just to be clear, I wouldn't say like calling it an illusory tree is a mistranslation. I just don't think it quite gets the same idea across as strongly as the Japanese does. Because the Japanese does have those connotations of it being like illusory or a phantom, but it's a little bit stronger, and so like incorporeal or like a spirit tree would make more sense. And so if you want to compare the actual Erdtree and Leyndell to the little saplings that have the golden seeds, that's fine. That might just be like a little bit of a difference of opinion. But at the very least, I do wonder then, how is fire meant to interact with that kind of metaphysical substance? Of course, we do have a very special flame to burn it, so there might be something more to it. But then again, we could also ask ourselves, where does the ash come from if that tree was an illusion? Is it only the stump that we've been, burning, and that's where all the ash came from? These are just kind of some of the questions that I think can get brought up as a consequence of this line of thought here. Can I pull up the description for the Memory of Grace? Yeah, 1 second. Is there anything in that, oops, you want to look at specifically? Let me go ahead and zoom this in. Alright, so the memory of first grace, which once guided bygone tarnished to the lands between. Lose all runes and return to the last sight of grace. It is merely a cycle. Stand before the Elden Ring, become the Elden Lord. So, yeah, I mean, you don't have the Japanese. Oh, so you wanted to know the Japanese about it? TA mentioned cycles. You thought this was relevant. All right, let's look at it. Yeah, so it merely repeats, like Kurikaisu. Like, yeah. A cycle is a really good way to localize that. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think there's an issue with saying that it's a cycle as much as I think the Tarnished Archaeologist has a little bit of flawed premises here. And hey, Jan Yarvis, welcome back to the stream. All right, let's go back into the video here.
Left, basically that which preceded the Erdtree, the remaining physical portion that remains after the phantom Erdtree has been consumed by the frenzied flame. So with all that cleared up, what can we say about this first burning? When did it happen? Is it the same thing as the shattering? What were its consequences? To answer these questions, we need to take a look at how Elden Ring tells its story through the timeline of its incantations. That tantalizing line of the Blessed Dew Talisman description indicates that after the Age of Plenty closed, the Erdtree, rather than being something tangible which offered real benefits, became entirely an object of faith, and the process of transformation of that faith tells a deep and obscure story. If we start with the prayer books themselves...
So yeah, I kind of would disagree with the conclusion that he came to here. All right, let's go ahead and put this over here. So he's kind of right in that the Blessed Dew Talisman says the Age of Plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith rather than like completely an object of faith. And I think this is the very first critical flaw that Tarnished Archaeologist is going to make throughout this video. And he's going to say something else here shortly that's going to be pretty off basis, in my opinion.
Which represent distinct schools, their symbols say quite a bit about this evolution of faith. First, we have the ancient Erdtree incantations, which include the Crucible incantations. And as we know, the Crucible phase is the beginning of the grafted Erdtree. What the ancient Erdtree incantation...
And so if anybody is less familiar with his previous videos, his opinion is that there was likely a great tree that existed before the Erdtree, the one that Godfrey and Marika created together, and they did something to graft their current version of the Erdtree onto a pre-existing rootstock, and that is what he calls the Crucible. It's a time of competing rootstocks growing into the golden scion, which would go on to create like the golden lineage and this Erdtree here. And so, if I remember correctly, he also argues that the very first Erdtree was coniferous, or not Erdtree, my apologies, that the original Great Tree was coniferous, and that this Erdtree is deciduous, although I have very strong disagreements with how he came to his conclusions. I don't think he goes into that too specifically in this video, so I'll leave it alone for now, at least. Ancient artery incantations. All right.
Show in both the prayer book form and the insignia behind the individual incantations is a full-bodied physical tree with the Elden Ring seemingly embedded into it, indeed the grafted source of the Erdtree's life-giving power. The first of these incantations is Elden Stars, explicitly the oldest Erdtree incantation, as it refers to the arrival of the golden star bearing the Elden Beast, an event which happened long before the age of the Erdtree. This ancient Erdtree set includes the Crucible incantations, as we said, as well as Blessing's Boon and Blessing of the Erdtree, both of which speak of the Age of Plenty. Interestingly, Malekith's Black Blade also dates to this era, but we'll return to that story later. So, incantations discovered in this era derive from the power of the Crucible, the Erdtree's grafted initial form, and the Erdtree's Age of Plenty, when life-giving blessed sap dripped in abundance from its bows. This era of bounty, as we know, was fleeting. Next we have the era of Erdtree worship, which, paradoxically, is represented by a very different symbol, one that de-emphasizes the actual arboreal form of the Erdtree in favor of its metaphorical representation. Gone are the deep roots and bountiful canopy of the ancient Erdtree incantations. Instead, there is only the symbolic representation of the Erdtree, a Celtic cross with the Elden Ring at its center, and of course, surrounded by conspicuously fallen leaves. So how do you get from the Age of Plenty with a bountiful tree to an age of Erdtree worship in which the tree itself is gone and has been replaced by an object of faith? Well, as we established earlier in this video, that is exactly the transition that occurs after the first burning of the Erdtree. So, with that...
So, I have really big problems with the language used here, kind of in multiple ways. I think like this whole sentence as a run-on sentence is kind of really bad in trying to keep points separate and focused away from each other. And then pedantic stuff like that aside, they use language like they established earlier in this video. So hold on, let's just listen to it directly here.
Well, as we established earlier in this video, that is exactly the transition that occurs after the first burning of the Erdtree.
So they're trying to definitively state that the Erdtree was burned after Godfrey's time, and that's what led into the time of the Erdtree worship. However, they have not supplied any textual evidence for this claim, and it's just being a bit circular that the burning of the Erdtree is what ended the Age of the Abundance, because the burning of the Erdtree ended the Age of Abundance here. So that's a very critical flaw here so far. They will go into it a bit more detail in the future, but I'm just trying to have you all on the same page that I am, that they have not fully set this up. And so they kind of make conclusions without giving us all the premises of their conclusions first, which makes it hard to follow what their line of thought is to see where they may be going wrong, to state it a little bit bluntly there.
So, with that in mind, let's fill in some of the gaps. The Ancient Erdtree era, aka the Age of Plenty, ends with the first burning of the Erdtree. Likewise, one of the Erdtree incantations from this era, Wrath of Gold, is said to have been discovered when the Elden Ring was shattered, again linking this new era to a post-shattered world.
So he's technically not wrong here, although this is ridiculously misleading in my opinion, because if you're not extremely familiar with the entirety of the game's text, or at least the text of the other incantations, you would take this claim at face value that the shattering has to coincide with this new sigil appearing, whereas it is very, very, very clearly not the case when we look at other incantations like Barrier of Gold most specifically. So we do have that sigil in the background, and it says one of the incantations of Erdtree worship. And this incantation was used by the champions of the Erdtree in the First and Second Liurnian Wars, during which the red-haired Radagon joined the heroes' ranks. So, if you're not super familiar with the text, what does that mean? Well, we do know that Radigan was in Liurnia while Godfrey was still in the Lands Between doing whatever he was doing. So, based on Tarnished Archaeologist claims that this represents a new age, he should be factually incorrect based on this premise, because the Age of Abundance would still be going on when Radigan, or like when Godfrey's still around, essentially. So I'll leave that alone for here. And I hate myself and want to die. Welcome to the stream. When is the most likely time period of the first burning of the Erdtree? That's a very, very good question. And honestly, I would say that it's arguable and we don't have explicit confirmation about when or how that happened, because there is a little bit of ambiguity in the timeline with the first cardinal sin. So you could make the argument that the first cardinal sin coincides with the war against the giants, and the giants may have burned the Erdtree or an Erdtree or something along those lines, and then Marika and Godfrey sealed it so that their Erdtree couldn't be burned again. So that's one way to read it. You could also make the argument that like Grantax burned the Erdtree, or that the Erdtree could have been burned between the transition of Godfrey being forced down as Elden Lord and the ascension of Radigan to the throne of Elden Lord. So there's a lot of ways one could argue that the Erdtree got burned. We don't know like when the first burning was, to be more specific. And Chadwick Dillon, nice to see you again. I believe that Tarnished Archaeologist's obfuscation of the truth is malicious or incompetent. I mean, I would prefer the latter, because I don't want to attribute to malice to what could be explained by ignorance. And obviously that kind of terminology is a little bit strong here, but I do think that the Tarnished Archaeologist has a tendency to come up with a solution and support that solution and kind of tunnel vision on how that works, rather than seeing if they can pick holes in it and see if that theory does stand in the face of the evidence of the other parts of the game. And so this has kind of been a repeating pattern to the way that they've been making videos. And so I had mentioned earlier that they made a comment in a previous video about hold on, I actually have a couple notes about it. So they made a comment on how Okay, so there's two parts about it. Remember how I said earlier he believed in a great tree first, then it being like essentially cut down or burned down, we don't really know, and then Godfrey's crucible Erdtree was grafted onto the roots of the great tree? Well, that idea presupposes that there was a great tree before the Erdtree, which is, you know, it's fine, it's arguable. I can accept that as kind of like a tenuous headcanon. However, they do have another video where they talk about the religion of the tree in general, which I should probably like look at the channel and see what it is. And they made the comment that this church in Lanedell, this is kind of like a Salian style, Nox style church, and it may have been retrofitted or may have been like the birth of the belief in the Erdtree or something along those lines. And they made the comment that the depiction of this Erdtree doesn't appear anywhere else, which is kind of true. And so they used this relief statue to justify that the faith of the Erdtree was secretive, kind of like how early Christians had to practice their religion secretly, something along those lines. I don't remember it verbatim, I apologize. And so that claim there could be fine, except to make this claim, they have to conveniently forget about the Great Tree stuff that they brought up in the video either immediately before or immediately after the one where they made this claim. And so when they said that the depiction of this Erdtree doesn't appear anywhere in the game, I was a little bit skeptical of it, and I thought this could have been like a squished rendering of another relief sculpture, statue, whatever you want to call it, because I noticed that it had like the rounded edges, which reminded me of the rounded stuff here. So I literally went into MS Paint and took the depiction of the Erdtree that I found on the entrance of of the Caria Manor, and I put it into paint. I shrunk it down to be approximately the same size as this one, and I noticed it didn't look exactly the same. And then once I realized that like this branch was on the other side, I flipped the image. So like this branch over here came over this way, and while these aren't exactly identical, I think that the way that they phrase a lot of their arguments is truly misleading, and I don't think it's malicious in the sense that they're trying to mislead others as much as they're kind of misleading themselves, which I really feel awful for like saying that, but it's just kind of how I actually feel about a lot of their videos at this point. I wasn't really familiar with a lot of their content, and after the Bloodborne video, I kind of like started to pick up on this stuff here, which then led to me watching their backlog, and I got up to this point and I felt like, okay, I really needed to address some things. Like, I don't want to go point by point and address every video, but I do want Tarnished Archaeologist to take this as kind of constructive feedback, even though I'm phrasing things a bit harshly here, for which I apologize. But I am really passionate about this subject, and I do think it's important to get contrary opinions if they help each channel grow. And that applies to you guys as well. Like, if you guys ever find something that I say that's wrong or might be misleading, let me know. It might suck to hear it the first time, but eventually I'll probably accept it and, ultimately be more grateful than anything about it, I would hope. So, yeah. Kinman, welcome back to this stream. Giants burned, the Great Tree confirmed. Yeah, the Great Tree. It's delusional, except not so harsh a word. Self-deception? Maybe. Did I do the Bloodborne reaction on stream? Yeah, Stella. We did that like last week, I think. Last weekend, maybe. So it's on the live stream archive. All right. So what were we saying about this? Oh yeah, Wrath of Gold. So he is trying to make the claim that this sigil ties it to the Shattering specifically, but just to reiterate what I had been saying a moment ago, Barrier of Gold shows that this sigil well predates the Shattering, in my opinion, and I do think there is more textual evidence to back that up, which we'll get into as we go along this video.
Again, linking this new era to a post-shattered world. And if you think about it, the linking of Cycles of Burning to the Shattering and Reformation of the Elden Ring is not so surprising when you consider that it's exactly what we do in-game. We burn down the Erdtree so that we can reform or repair or alter the Elden Ring. These two processes are inextricably linked. And based on Ragier's dialogue, which tells us that the Night of the Black Knives happened during the Golden Age of the Erdtree and preceded the Shattering, we can place this event. Of course, the exact relationship between the Night of the Black Knives and the First Burning are topics we've touched upon previously.
So this, I think, was, I would hope, an error in editing where they had spliced two different audio tracks together, so they completely cut off the point that they were making and just turned this into a really long run-on sentence, which doesn't connect directly with what they were saying before. So I'm going to back it up, then I'll let him finish the thought, and then I'll address it.
The Night of the Black Knives happened during the Golden Age of the Erdtree and preceded the Shattering. We can place this event. Of course, the exact relationship between the Night of the Black Knives and the First Burning are topics we've touched upon previously, and as one of the core mysteries of the game, we will return to soon enough.
So they're trying to say that the Shattering corresponds with the event which you just mentioned. However, that, I think, gets directly contradicted with how Godwin had to have died and is predicated on destined death already being sealed, whereas Tarnished Archaeologist thinks that the sealing of destined death occurred post-Shattering. But to be fair, based on what I remember about Smotown's video with the timeline, when... No, Tarnished Archaeologist does say it this way. Okay, so I'll explain it two different ways to give you guys two different ways to interpret this beyond what he's going to say directly here. So the first way which Tarnished Archaeologist is saying this is that Destined Death was sealed upon Malekith putting the blade into his flesh after the shattering, but he also makes it sound as though that's the first time that Destined Death gets removed from the Elden Ring, which shouldn't work because Ranni stole death from him. So death should have already been removed from the Elden Ring because she needed that death to kill Godwyn. So, yeah. All right. Was there anything else that I wanted to say about that? No. So just to kind of summarize my point here, he's trying to make the argument that the shattering happened after the shattering coincides with the end of the Age of Plenty because that's when the Erdtree burned. However, in order for the shattering to happen, I argue Destined Death needs to already be sealed so that way Ranni can steal it and kill Godwyn.
Lives happened during the Golden Age of the Erdtree and preceded the shattering. We can place this event, of course, the exact relationship between the Night of the Black Knives and the First Burning are topics we've touched upon previously, and as one of the core mysteries of the game, we will return to soon enough. So the First Burning of the Erdtree ends the Age of Plenty and begins the Age of Erdtree worship, symbolized by the metaphorical phantom Erdtree. Members of the faithful began using the Erdtree seal, which is explicitly called formless, and tells us that faith in this formless symbol holds the answers, even though the Elden Ring was shattered.
So there are a lot of mistakes here, and the first I'll go back to mentioning our favorite barrier of gold right here. So in order for the shattering to work, in my opinion, you already need Radagon to have, at the very least, married Rennala to have the Carian children. And so you can still kind of make that argument because Ranni needs to exist to kill Godwyn, obviously. However, how could this symbol be used by Radagon if it only exists after the shattering? So how could it be used by Radagon in Liurnia if it only came into being after the shattering? I do think this is, kind of the same point, but I'm just kind of re-emphasizing it because it comes up again. And then the second point, I think, is just a very ignorant statement in that he's trying to claim because the Erdtree seal is formless, that the Erdtree itself is formless and is a literal object of faith, when that is very directly contradicted in the other sigils or seals for incantations. The ones specifically which have no weight because they're formless. So the Golden Order seal is a formless sacred seal depicting the ceremonial observation of order. The Frenzied Flame seal is a formless sacred seal bestowed by the Maidens of the Three Fingers, or Maiden of the Three Fingers. And even the Dragon Communion seal is formless Drakeblood seal. And I think this one is the most significant because you could very easily make the argument that Dragon Communion should predate a lot of the other things, so you could make the claim that it definitely predates the Golden Order. So it's not as though the Erdtree was already incorporeal, perhaps, when Dragon Communion was around, although, it's kind of contentious. So lots of really really bad arguments based off of really shaky foundations, which crumble when you have the greater context of the game to compare them to. So this is a big issue that I find throughout Tarnished Archaeologist's videos, that they tunnel vision on the conclusion that they want and kind of ignore the other relevant evidence, either due to tunneling on this stuff or just being unaware of them, which both are unfortunate. So, right. I want to go back to chat, and because Beans and Rice said something very interesting, and that they said they think a few things are happening at the same time with Tarnished Archaeologist. First, his opinion is changing in real time, and second, he's making YouTube videos and trying to grow. And you think that he's looking at the game as piles of an incomplete history. Many times that level of investigation has to be done more and more often through contextual clues. And yeah, so I do think that there is obviously the entertainment component aspect of it. I do really respect their broad understanding of history and art history. I've learned quite a bit from their channel. I appreciate a lot of these observations, but my bigger issues with these claims tend to deal with the language that's used around them, and something which will come up later, maybe not later on in this video, but throughout many of their videos that I found, is that they kind of double dip on what an idea or object symbolizes. And so they make one justification on the symbolism of one thing, and then they'll change their opinion about that thing to fit another symbol. So sorry, I articulated that really poorly. I'm trying to think of an example which they double dip from. I know I mentioned something in the Bloodborne video where they double dipped on the idea that so yeah. In Bloodborne, there's a statue there's a bunch of statues that he references throughout the video, but there's one in Old Yarnum where there's a bunch of figures like looking up to the sky, and he argues that they're looking up in surprise, and they're coming into contact with a great one of the moon. So the moon is what they're looking up to with their shocked faces in one statue specifically. However, there's another statue later on which is kind of has a similar pose, but rather than saying they're looking up in surprise, he says now this time they're receiving the word of God, in that Mary, whom the statue, he argues, symbolizes, is receiving the knowledge that she's going to have the Son of God, Jesus. So while both might be simultaneously possible readings, it's just kind of a little disingenuous to me to double dip with such frequency. And every once in a while, it's not that big a deal to me, but I've noticed a kind of repeating trend throughout these videos here. You'd say that TA is lying through a mission quite a hefty amount, but albeit maybe unintentionally. I hope it's unintentional. I mean, I feel like they're trying to make a story and craft it and present it to an audience to keep them going along with it. However, if they were more clear that these are just possible interpretations and not stated so matter-of-factly, I would not feel as up in arms about this as I do right now. Do I think FromSoft has gotten more ambiguous over time? Yes, absolutely. Even in DS3, it feels like there were a lot of loose ends introduced in comparison to Bloodborne, DS1, and Elden Ring seems so similarly scattered, yeah. So I made a video a couple weeks back about the inconsistencies and hearsay used in FromSoft games, and you can actually kind of see them grow over the chronological release of their game. So like Dark Souls 1 is pretty self-contained. Dark Souls 2 has a bit more hearsay or like defiance of expectations. Bloodborne has a respectable amount, but nothing too crazy because it is like the one game. Then Dark Souls 3 really grows, and then Elden Ring is just way larger than all the other ones in terms of like betraying expectations. At this point, you'd say it's straight up negligence amount of obliviousness if it's unintentional. Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. I think that either Tarnished Archaeologist is being deliberately deceptive or kind of negligent at not having a stronger understanding of the text as a result of their approach of relying more on archaeology and trying to base their videos on archaeology rather than a marriage of archaeology, visual clues, and literal game text. What would he gain from being malicious? It's it's not. I mean, if you're growing a channel, he might have it monetized. It could just be fame. I don't want to like say that it's malicious because I would prefer not to think it. There could be any number of motives for it. All right. So going back to his video.
Remember that grace actually controls what you see. Many NPCs react with surprise and envy when they learn that we can still see the guidance of grace. And the Golden Rune description asks us, quote, "Do you see the Erdtree towering over there?" End quote. The implication of this question being that some people don't even see the Erdtree at all. The only reason to ask if we see the gigantic golden tree towering in the distance, which would be an absurd question otherwise, is that not everyone can see it, just like not everyone can see the guidance of grace.
So this I would have some very major disagreements about, and I feel like the way that they just said that so dismissively is a little bit infuriating, because I would make the argument that the description of the golden runes there could just be using a rhetorical device to connect the idea of the Erdtree to runes. So not only that, apparently this has become an issue for like a lot of players where they don't actually think that the Erdtree that we see in game can be seen by most other characters, which didn't really occur to me, and it just kind of kept cropping up. And I do think there are multiple cases where that is kind of directly contradicted, but I guess you could make it arguments about it either way. So just to bring up a couple examples of people talking about the Erdtree as though it's like right there. First, when Bach talks about, did you see the Erdtree when he first gets into Leyndell proper? Yeah, I don't necessarily think he's saying, do you see the stump of the Erdtree? I think he's just trying to say like, holy crap, I've never been this close to the Erdtree. Do you actually see how freaking magnificent this is? Of course, it's a rhetorical question to me, but some people have taken it literally, which, you know, it's fine. I do like to entertain those kind of rhetorical questions to see if there can be more that we can learn from that. But we do have other cases of people talking about the Erdtree as though they can see it, which is a little bit ironic because this lady is blind. So she says, surely you see it too. The gold that enshrouds the heavens, the great tree which begets the pillars of light. So she's telling us to go to the base of the Erdtree to become Elden Lord, because she's a finger reader cone. Can she actually see it? She literally has no eyeballs. Maybe she's lying to us. But okay, setting her aside, we do have a very other interesting NPC to consider. Apparently, Patches talks about it. If you get sent into like Volcano Manor, he says like the Erdtree is right outside if you just like stepped outside to go see it. But I think that's kind of wishy-washy. And before I continue, I do want to say thank you to Miata07 on Reddit for having like made a post about it, which kind of like actually drew my attention to this thing being questionable to some people. So they provided some of these examples, which is why like I can directly provide them for you. So the next NPC I want to talk about is Muriel. It says, our church holds in view the monuments of both houses. So this is kind of a present statement. The Erdtree of the capital in the Academy of Rea Lucaria. So it would seem very out of character to me for Muriel to say the Erdtree is in view if most people can't see it. Does this imply that Muriel is amongst the few who can see it? Does Muriel then have the guidance of grace? It just doesn't ring true to me. I don't believe that the Erdtree is a phantom Erdtree, kind of what in the way that Tarnished Archaeologist is suggesting here. And I think further evidence for this, in my opinion, would be the fact that you can see the Erdtree in many paintings. So were those painters all tarnished when they did it? How did they know what the Erdtree looked like if the depictions of those Erdtrees match this one? And that kind of also ties into the burning Erdtree depiction in Volcano Manor. Although obviously Volcano Manor does have like a bunch of tarnished in it, but I digress. Kinman says, Militia seems a bit strong. You think TA just wants to make high-quality videos for cool theories, which you honestly respect? Yeah, that's kind of the take that I get. And that's why I do want to address this as strongly as I can, because I think it is becoming a bit problematic how straightforwardly they're presenting their opinions as fact and kind of misleading a significant chunk of the community, which kind of becomes a lot harder to interact with when they have misconceptions about like some of the most basic facts of the game, in my opinion. You find that line in the description very interesting about the Erdtree towering over? Yeah. The Erdtree of the capital right over there pans to nothing. Alright, let's go back to the video here. I'm going to back up a couple seconds.
Quote, "Do you see the Erdtree towering over there?" End quote. The implication of this question being that some people don't even see the Erdtree at all. The only reason to ask if we see the gigantic golden tree towering in the distance, which would be an absurd question otherwise, is that not everyone can see it, just like not everyone can see the guidance of grace. Indeed, these days, the Erdtree is merely an object of faith. Just like in early Christianity, faith in the divinity of its subject only deepened after that subject was long dead.
And so this is why I think Tarnished Archaeologist is having so many issues with some of these more basic parts of the story, in my opinion. That I think they're coming into it with the idea of trying to impress the lens of early Christianity onto Elden Ring. And while I do think it's actually really cool, I just don't think it works with the way that it's currently being presented. I don't necessarily think it's incompatible with the game, but I do think Tarnished Archaeologist has some issues with the supports for their ideas here, unfortunately.
The incantations developed during this time tell the story of war on behalf of the Erdtree. Not the wars that founded the Empire, like the war against the Giants, but the later wars of territorial aggression. Barrier of Gold was used in the Liurnian Wars. Golden Lightning Fortification was used in the war against the dragons after Grandsax attacked. Then, according to the Protection of the Erdtree incantation, through countless victories in war, the Erdtree became the embodiment of order. In other words, this era closes with the founding of the Golden Order.
So, if we go into what he was just saying a moment ago here, and this is an unfortunate case of him double dipping on interpretations of how things work, he's kind of simultaneously saying right now, at least, that the shattering happened, and that's why we get Wrath of Gold along with these other these other incantations. However, he's saying that the Golden Order comes into being now with the Liurnian Wars and the war against the dragons, and I think in his mind he does believe that all of this happens after the shattering. And if that's true, it just directly contradicts this, because Radigan used this incantation before Ranni and the other Carians were even born, you know?
The founding event of the Golden Order seems to be the removal of the Rune of Death, at least as told to us by Enya. And of course, after this, later on, the Golden Order fundamentalists become obsessed with death, Deathroot, and those who live in death.
And of course, it is also given to us a bit more straightforward in the Mending Rune of the Death Prince, and not just Enya's dialogue, so...
But just like we did for the Ancient Erdtree and Erdtree Faith eras, let's take a look at the prayer book for more information. The Golden Order Principia, as it is called, is clearly a reference to...
All right, so before he gets into the kind of off-topic comparison to Isaac Newton, which I really enjoy actually, I did want to address the idea that they're saying the shattering happened, which allowed the Erdtree faith practice to come into being, but now they're also making the argument that with the shattering came the sealing of destined death, as well as the rise of the Golden Order. And so to me, it would seem like there should be a bit of a mismatch, that the Erdtree is also a symbol of faith, but now we have the Golden Order existing alongside it. And of course, I do think that issue even pertains without this paradigm here that the Tarnished Archaeologist is setting up. But in my mind, I would make the argument that the Age of Plenty coincides with faith in the Erdtree waning as a byproduct of the Erdtree wasting like all other forms of life, which is said in, let's see here, Blessing of the Erdtree. The Erdtree once flourished with abundance, yet it was only for a fleeting moment, such is the course of all life. And this is something that they don't touch on, that why was it such a fleeting moment that the Age of Abundance existed? They tend to say that it's because the fire stopped the age, but I don't think that's really aligned super well with how we have other descriptions that say that the Blessed Dew stopped and people thought that it would go on forever. So I do think the sap stopped, and once the Erdtree could physically no longer produce its blessings, people just kind of looked at it as a spiritual blessing rather than like the literal physical ones that they'd been bestowed by like America directly, according to like the Erdtree's favor talisman and stuff.
Faith eras. Let's take a look at the prayer book for more information. The Golden Order Principia, as it is called, is clearly a reference to Isaac Newton's Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, often referred to simply as Principia or Principia if you really want to impress your friends, which is probably the single most famous piece of scientific work ever produced. In it, Newton lays out the equations and principles that guide the fundamental workings of the universe and have tortured high school physics students ever since. The core principles, the fundamentals you might call them, were his universal law of gravitation, the notion that all objects with mass contain an attractive force, and his laws of motion, probably the most famous of which is the dictum, quote, "To every action there is always opposed an equal reaction," end quote. Universal gravitation, the attractive force which governs the motions of the heavenly bodies and fallen apples alike, is the cognate to the Golden Order's law of regression, quote, "that all things yearn eternally to converge," end quote. Likewise, Newton's laws of motion, specifically the third law, is the cognate to the Golden Order's law of causality, which is, quote, "the pull between meanings, that which links all things in a chain of relation," end quote. So the fundamentals of the Golden Order, which describe the laws of the universe, take clear inspiration from these most famous of physical laws. But the story goes much deeper than that. You see, the word causality there tells us quite a bit. The philosophical notion that, to borrow the Golden Order's phrase, all things are linked in a chain of relation, is called determinism, and it basically begins with Newton. Newton's laws were so widely applicable, so perfect in describing the motion of bodies from the sun and the planets to how an arrow flies through the air, that they started a revolution in how people thought about the natural world. A famous thought experiment known as Laplace's demon succinctly sums up the issue. If we can predict all future events of a system by knowing its original state, then if some being were to know everything about the universe right now, the positions and momenta of all particles in the universe, then that being would be able to know the entire history and future of the universe with perfect precision. This thought terrified some, but to Newton, actually this clockwork precision of the universe, That the position of Mars or Venus could be predicted with absolute certainty was evidence of the power of God, not an argument against him. Hence the quote we cited in the introduction, quote, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being," end quote. But many wondered, if these laws were so universal and we could understand cause and effect so perfectly, what about us? Are we just physical bodies whose actions can be perfectly predicted? Was there any room in these laws for free will? So it should be no surprise then that many rejected the notion of determinism based on exactly this issue. And like in Newton's day, the issue of free will was an issue for the Golden Order. How else to interpret Goldmask's conception of perfect order, which he believes corrects the fundamental flaw of the Golden Order? What was that flaw? Well, according to his mending room, quote, "The current imperfection of the Golden Order, or instability of ideology, can be blamed on the fickleness of the gods no better than men. That is the fly in the ointment," end quote.
So yeah, I do really appreciate the kind of parallel that he's drawing with Newton and Golden Order fundamentalism. I don't really have any problems with that. But I do think it's a little bit unfortunate that when they do make such neat ties into the lore of the game, that tends to give them a bit more credibility, where some of their other readings of the actual game text, I think, are much weaker, and they seem strengthened by the power of these connections. But going into this point further, I do want to address it. I think he just kind of moves past it, so I might just need to remember to come back to this when it'll make more sense to do so.
The fickleness of the gods, just like the fickleness of men, lies in the choices they make. Indeed, in the very act of making choices, the one element of the material world that would not be adherent to perfect deterministic order: free will. Goldmask's solution to the vexing issue of free will, likewise drawn from parallels in Renaissance history, is a story for another day.
Chapter 5, All Things Can Be Conjoined.
It might seem a bit counterintuitive at first that one of the founding works of modern science is portrayed in Elden Ring as a holy book, upon which an entire religion is based. After all, these days faith and science are often seen as antithetical. Take, for example, Francis Collins, who was seen as a controversial and unique choice to run the U.S. National Institutes of Health because he was also a strong believer in Christianity. But this was not always the case. In Elden Ring and in real history, the dividing lines between faith and science are not so clear. In fact, specifically during the Renaissance, there was a wide effort to incorporate the classical, that is to say Greek and Latin, as well as Abbasid Arab, scientific and philosophical principles into current doctrines of faith. This was part of the great project of Renaissance humanism, which spawned great thinkers and artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and, of course, Isaac Newton. Newton himself was famously pious, a devout Christian believing that his discovery of laws that permeate all of nature were clear proof of the existence of God, whose commands all of creation follows. Indeed, an entire appendix in Principia is dedicated to precisely this point. One of the consequences of the Renaissance, the Christian Renaissance specifically, was the merging of the classical natural and moral philosophies with Christian doctrine. In Elden Ring, this merging effort is represented by the will of one man, Radagon. Radagon is a Renaissance man, through and through. The pose of his statues is taken straight from Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, a classic example of Renaissance art and Da Vinci's conception of the perfectly proportioned man. Just like the Renaissance humanists, Radagon attempted to merge the classics with religious doctrine. His icon tells us, quote, "As the husband of Ranala of Caria, the red-haired Radagon studied sorcery, and as the husband of Queen Marika, he studied incantations. Thus did he aspire to be complete." End quote. And the Golden Order incantations require both faith and intelligence to master. Like the Renaissance thinkers who rediscovered the old texts of Plato, Plutarch, Aristotle, Al-Kindi, and the rest, Radagon studied the ancient scrolls of the Academy of Raya and merged these principles with faith in the Erdtree and the Elden Ring.
And right, I don't really have any problems with these ties right here. I do think they're very straightforward and make a lot of sense, and I agree with them. And remember, we'll need to come back to the Gold Mask stuff when it's a little bit more relevant.
Thereby spawning the Golden Order. As Muriel says, heresy is but a contrivance. All things can be conjoined. So we have an
So that goes back into an issue that I don't think is Tarnished Archaeologist is alone in having. It's justifying when the Golden Order first came into being. I am also of the opinion that it comes into being with Radagon, and more specifically on his ascension to the throne of Elden Lord is when it gets instituted into the Order specifically, most likely upon the removal of Destined Death. However, I do know that there's a very large number of people who believe that the Golden Order was instituted when Marika and Godfrey did their thing, and that the Glomide Queen and whatnot should have been defeated way earlier in the timeline to keep the Root of Death out of the Elden Ring.
Contrivance. All things can be conjoined. So we have an Age of Plenty era defined by the ancient Erdtree incantations and represented by a dominant, fully corporeal Erdtree with its bountiful canopy. Godfrey is Elden Lord in this era, and the Erdtree is a real tree which blesses the faithful with its life-giving sap. Then the Erdtree burns, and so the age of Erdtree worship is represented by the Phantom Erdtree.
So the way that they set up their arguments, they're kind of drawn out, and it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult to stay on topic with what they're saying. And they are saying in other places that this corresponds with the Shattering, although it's not quite as upfront here. I'm just going to back up so you guys can listen to that again, and I'll let it play through.
Fully corporeal Erdtree.
Let me back up a little bit further.
So we have an Age of Plenty era defined by the ancient Erdtree incantations and represented by a dominant, fully corporeal Erdtree with its bountiful canopy. Godfrey is Elden Lord in this era, and the Erdtree is a real tree which blesses the faithful with its life-giving sap. Then the Erdtree burns, and so the age of Erdtree worship is represented by the Phantom Erdtree, the metaphorical representation of the Elden Ring's power. But what is the representation of the Golden Order? Once again, if we look at the incantations in the prayer book, much is revealed. Gone is even the symbolic representation of the Erdtree. All that is left is the Elden Ring, and the triangle which has been added to bind it. The triangle and ring visual again being suspiciously similar to the Vitruvian Man, whose legs were so well proportioned that they form an equilateral triangle. This triangle is, of course, also quite evocative of the symbols of the Holy Trinity, the Christian Orthodox answer to the question, how could Jesus be both fully a man and fully a god? Much like Corrin's question,
the Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god. However, the name of Marika's second husband, King Consort Radagon, also appeared. Who exactly was Radagon?
Goldmask struggles to rectify the dual nature of Marika and Radagon in the same way that early Christians struggled to rectify Jesus' dual nature. And in both cases, the answer is much less based on logic than it is faith.
Think that Radagon was Marika herself, or at least such is all I can interpret from the rhythm and calculus of his finger. How would such a thing even have been possible, I wonder? Sadly, I cannot comprehend it myself.
So I do think that's a kind of wonderful comparison, although I don't think the way that Tarnished Archaeologist is trying to fit it into the timeline works, unfortunately. And I'll explain more about that when he gets a little bit further along here.
The Erdtree was corporeal in the Age of Plenty, and a phantom in the Erdtree Faith era. So what happens to it during the Golden Order era?
And this is kind of where I have a little bit of issues following along with him sometimes, because the way that this sentence is phrased, it makes it sound as though there's 3 specific periods. However, he kind of contradicts himself in a couple places. So earlier he said the Age of Plenty ended with the Shattering, and that corresponds with the burning of the Erdtree, which is, very straightforward here. But then when he phrases things as though what happens to the...
in the Erdtree Faith era.
Erdtree in the Erdtree Faith era, and then what happens to it in the Golden Order era, it makes them sound as though they should have distinct eras. So in his mind, I don't know what the difference is between the Erdtree Faith era and the Golden Erdtree era, if both of these take place after the Shattering.
So what happens to it during the Golden Order era? To answer that, we will need to take a look at Radagon's symbol, seen best on his sword seal and on the Elden Ring itself. His symbol is a trellis, a structure used to support climbing plants.
And just to give some context as to why he's bringing this up, he did ask the question, where does Radagon's power come from? Which I kind of forgot about in the deluge of information that I used my first time watching this video. So where does Radagon's power come from? Keep that in mind as you look at this.
That's right, boys and girls. It's time for another Tarnished Botany lesson.
Chapter 6, Radagon of the Vine.
Trellises are latticed structures used to support the growth of climbing plants like shrubs or vines. An odd choice for a symbol, for sure, until one realizes that vines have actually completely taken over Leyndell in its current state. As we've pointed out many times, the physical Erdtree itself is just a stump at this point, with a golden phantom in its place. But that's not to say there isn't any new growth. In fact, giant invasive vines have overtaken the Erdtree Sanctuary and its surroundings. You know they're vines and not roots because, well, they visually match. They aren't contaminated with deathroot the way that the roots are. They exhibit characteristic climbing patterns which are not seen in roots because roots are gravitropic. They grow down. Only vines invade buildings and take such tortuous paths, growing sideways and upwards like this, in search of supporting structures. Exactly, by the way, what trellises provide. We can also clearly delineate them based on their braided nature, similar to woody grapevines, an easy way to tell them apart from the actual Erdtree roots. Let's not forget, too, that thorny vines are what have blocked off the entrance to the base of the Erdtree and access to the Elden Ring. It's no coincidence that when we defeat Malekith and unleash the Rune of Death, not only do we burn the thorny vines that block access to the Elden Ring, but we burn the giant vines in the Sanctuary too. Both are burned by the Flame of Ruin, and both are absent in the Capital of Ash and the Mending Rune cutscenes. They're both gone because they were both part of the same growth, and that growth is the source of Radagon's power.
So he is saying that Radagon is associated with the vines, and apparently the vines are the source of his power, which I would have very strong disagreements about that. However, just to go back to the idea of vines specifically, as far as I'm aware, vines don't come from trees specifically. They come from other organisms climbing trees. And so, while I think the trellis is a neat comparison, I don't necessarily think that's actually supposed to represent the quote-unquote holism of Radagon's power. And I think focusing on Radigan from this angle does a disservice as to his role in helping tame Raya Lucaria and the moon and conjoin it with the Erdtree specifically. He does bring it up briefly, but I do think it would have made a stronger point overall that literally the fate in the night sky was kind of brought under control by Radigan's meddling with Renala and stuff. And then the other thing that I would like to bring up in comparison to the Vine idea is that if Radigan is already in the Erdtree and he already has like the Elden Ring, it seems a little bit counterintuitive that he would need rings growing up from below ground to stop us. I mean, there might be something to it. It's just he's working externally to stop us when you could do it internally based off of Tarnished Archaeologist arguments here. And I don't really think it's a little anything like more than a coincidence with the level design. And yeah, so maybe the vines do come from Radigan, but I don't necessarily think that represents his power. And I would be more on board with the theory if he ever used anything more vine related in his fight. So yeah. Radigan could be an invasive vine. That is a possibility, but I don't really think it works quite that way. I mean, you might be able to argue like Marika's comments to him not being a god yet could kind of go along with those lines, but I don't know. Yeah, vines are also known for choking out other plant life, and I do think that Deathroot is kind of exemplifies that a bit better. If it's the Web of the Word, then it's a stronger candidate for a power symbol. Yeah, and that's another one that many people bring up as well, which is kind of why I tend to be a bit hesitant to ascribe one particular ideology or thought system or iconography to the visual metaphors in Elden Ring. And thanks for bringing that one back up, Beans and Rice. Did Radigan just want to shut everyone out, or was he trying to drive someone to burn the Erdtree? Well, if you recall, the thorns stop us because he wants us to shut everything out. I would make the argument that Radigan wants to preserve the Golden Order because he's the Leal Hound of the Golden Order, whereas Marika instigated the Shattering, so it's in her interests that the Erdtree gets burned and a new Elden Lord gets instituted and creates a new kind of order. Yeah, Ivy can tear apart mortar. It's pretty rough. Beautiful, but, terrible for that brickwork.
Radagon is no grafter. He's no arborist. And neither is he a zealot for the power of the Erdtree. But he is a zealot in defense of the Elden Ring. After all, he is the one who attempted to repair it after Marika shattered it. So it seems that Radagon, when confronted with the catastrophe of Marika's betrayal, her shattering of the Elden Ring, came up with a solution: to repair the Elden Ring as best he could, and then harness the power of invasive vines to protect and shield the Elden Ring from any future malfeasance. That is why vines are seen in his statues and his icon, and the golden trellis, his symbol, is shown supporting the growth of the thorns that block our path.
And, well, I do think that's an interesting thought here. I do believe he kind of contradicts himself later on here, even though there's only like 2 minutes left.
Unmistakable evidence of his plan. It is only by burning the whole thing down, thorny vines included, that we are able to access the Elden Ring and challenge him. The age of the ancient Erdtree begins as shown in the Crucible statues, pruned to foster the golden lineage of the Erdtree, and reaching its age of plenty. The age of Erdtree faith begins with the Erdtree felled and the Elden Ring shattered.
And so this is where he says it a bit more directly. Like I'd said a moment ago, it makes it sound a bit more vague when he talks about the era of the Erdtree faith and then the era of the Golden Order, but now he's clearer about it.
This age is dominated by an illusory phantom Erdtree, symboled by the Celtic cross on its sigil, and by Marika's statues, where a giant concealing veil hides the truth.
I don't know what he means by the concealing veil hiding the truth. If anybody in chat has more insight, please let me know. I should have like pulled up the icon for it, but I do think her veil was supposed to evoke the imagery of the umbilical cord that kind of like wrapped in on itself, which I think was supposed to symbolize that like Marika is her own mother because like the umbilical cord goes back to itself. So like Marika is her own mother because like she's her own child. And that was also like the gender swapping item in cut content. So a lot of really cool stuff that got cut, unfortunately. Yeah, Radigan's icon is also used at the barriers at Rea Lucaria. Technically, it's a little bit different, but I do think, as Teen Sith would say, that Radigan committed a little bit of academic dishonesty and maybe borrowed the design for his own speech contest. But yeah. Methoda said, maybe you missed it, but what do we think is actually the purpose of Radigan and his rune? What does it add? That's a good question. We don't know for certain. My headcanon is that Radigan's rune helps bind the fate in the night skies to the Elden Ring specifically, because we are told in the telescope that Carrion astrology withered on the vine in the age of the Erdtree, and it was fettered by the Golden Order. And so that in conjunction with how EG and certain other items mention that the fates of the Carians are tied to the night skies does tell me that the fate in the night skies were not fettered until the time of Radigan more specifically, and therefore the fate in the night skies were disconnected from Godfrey and Godfrey's version of the Elden Ring more specifically. And that could tie into the whole idea of destined death and fate in the night skies, because destined and fate uses the same character in Japanese, unme. You think he thinks her dress is a concealing veil, maybe? Huh. Let me back that up. Oh, you're assuming he's talking about the statue changes from Radigan America. Maybe.
Where a giant concealing veil hides an illusory phantom Erdtree, symboled by the Celtic cross on its sigil, and by Marika statues, where a giant concealing veil hides the truth.
That she's Radigan? I still don't quite follow.
Like Christians only deepening their faith in the divinity of Jesus after his resurrection, Erdtree faith is strengthened in response to the catastrophe of the burning of the Erdtree.
And so I feel like this is a bit of an exercise in circular logic, in that because he makes the claim that the Erdtree is gone, and because it's gone, it must increase the faith of others, because he believes in the idea that this Erdtree is illusory, and it ties back into that one description earlier. Which one was it? Was it Blessing of the Erdtree? I don't think it was. No. Blessing's Boon? Nope. Maybe it's like Blessed Dew Talisman. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's probably that. Let me pull that one back up. Oops, that was me, not you guys. Oh, yeah. It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time the Erdtree became more an object of faith. So this, as I mentioned way earlier in the video, that I do believe that the Erdtree still existed, but once its sap ran out, people still wanted to believe in it anyway because it was the symbol of their faith, even if it no longer gave out actual physical blessings at that time. Hey Stella, I know you're actually kind of behind in the chat, so I can't ask you what you're saying wait what to. You'd think his rune would be related to regression or causality. Oh yeah, that's another good way. So yeah, the Golden Order is... Oh yeah, let's just go ahead and pull up the thing. Immutable Shield says it specifically. that two concepts form the basis for Golden Order fundamentalism. One is the law of regression to which this incantation relates. So you could make the argument that the trellis relates to regression and causality specifically. Thanks for bringing that up.
Then, the Golden Order begins as death is removed from the Elden Ring, and the sickly Erdtree stump begins crown sprouting in a second Crucible era. This is symbolized in Radagon's statues, where he stands on the Crucible without tending to it. Instead...
And so, I mentioned this like 5 minutes ago, and part of it is because like I've been pausing so often. So now he's making the comparison that Radagon is standing on the Crucible, and nothing is being tended to it. And he does try to make the claim that Radagon creates a second Crucible later on, but I do feel like he's kind of picking his symbolism here selectively, which I kind of mentioned earlier. So I'm going to go ahead, back up. I apologize. Let me back up for like 5 seconds, let him make his points, and then I'll back up further to just kind of go back to my point.
In a second Crucible era. This is symbolized in Radagon's statues, where he stands on the Crucible without tending to it. Instead, he puts up a trellis to foster vine growth around the untended stump. In this age's apogee, defensive vines protect the Erdtree stump that still contains the Elden Ring. There is much more to talk about as we populate these eras defined by the evolution of faith in the lands between. When we continue this story, we'll discuss the heresies of the later stages in Leyndell's history, and with that, it may finally be time to talk about the fingers. And the Mending Rune cutscenes. They're both gone because they were both part of the same growth, and that growth is the source of...
I think I was muted. Yeah, I was muted. So I just kind of reiterated what he said here, that Radagon was the... damn it. What did I say? Yeah, so that Radagon is connected to the Crucible here, and that the Crucible is empty, and his rune trellis is being used to help facilitate its growth, and that I didn't disagree that the runes, that the vines on the Erdtree came from Radagon, but I do disagree with the idea that the trellis is connected to like a second Crucible. But for anybody who doesn't quite understand that idea that he's presenting here at the end, he's saying that after the first Age of Plenty, the Erdtree got burned due to the shattering? ? He doesn't really fill that out. So there was the shattering, the Erdtree got burned, and then Radagon helped get the Rune of Death removed or sealed into Malekith somehow, I don't know. And then he is creating a second kind of Crucible phase where his vines are going to be like the new golden scion, as opposed to like the Erdtree. I believe that's what he's trying to argue here, and obviously there's a lot of issues with that. And then after I said that I was going to like show this off, so just keep in mind that this is supposed to be the Crucible right now, I want to back up to the other symbol of Radagon that he was talking about earlier. Okay, so it's probably around here, isn't it? Okay, yeah. Let's go ahead.
And on the Elden Ring itself. His symbol is a trellis, a structure used to support climbing plants. That's right, boys and girls, it's time for another Tarnished Botany lesson. Trellises are latticed structures used to support the growth of climbing plants like shrubs or vines. Realizes that vines pointed out a golden fact.
Where was it?
the roots are torturous. Delineate them based on their braided nature. Will have blocked off the evidence that is in the sanctioned in the capital of Ath, the same.
Where was it?
The defense of the Elden Ring. Marika's betrayal, serving as shield the Elden Ring for many future malfeasance. His symbol.
Okay, here we go.
Let
me back up.
The Elden Ring, and then harness the power of invasive vines to protect and shield the Elden Ring.
So remember, there's the crucible and the vines on his statue, and now he's harnessing the power of the vines to shield the Elden Ring.
Many future malfeasance.
From future
That is why vines are
interruption.
seen in his statues and his icon. And the golden trellis, his symbol, is shown supporting the...
So he's saying that the vines don't really grow without him, but we do have the iconography of Radagon having like more defined growths around him, which isn't like completely incompatible with Tarnished Archaeologist's ideas here. However, one thing that I do wonder is if he is going to go so far as to connect Radagon with the Crucible here, then why doesn't he try to connect Radagon to the other like Crucible style statues that we can see all throughout the Lands Between? So like these ones specifically. And so this one's in Leyndell. So these kind of roots correspond to Radagon's statue. So who's to say that this wasn't Radagon? Could Radagon have been inadvertently born from Marika and Godfrey creating the Erdtree? Maybe. I don't really know. I don't want to put words into Tarnished Archaeologist's mouth about that idea specifically, but I do think it's kind of worth pointing out that he does say that Radagon isn't an arborist and doesn't like grow things earlier, and then he kind of says that he does later on. But either way, I still feel like those are really, really weak arguments, because I would say that the depiction of the Erdtree that we see now is still like Radagon's Erdtree by virtue of him being in it. It's not like he's disconnected from the Erdtree and only working with the vines, I think, but... yeah, okay. Hopefully I wasn't muted then. Okay, I wasn't. You do believe the lattice is Radagon's Elden Rune? Yeah, I 100% agree with that. However, I feel like the justifications that he makes based on that idea don't really follow the other bits of the text. And so there are a lot of small issues that kind of add up. Well, I guess they're not really all that small. There are a lot of issues that add up in this video, which makes it really difficult to talk about individual things, individual claims directly, partially because of how interconnected a lot of these things are, and of course, partially because of how most other people would view the timeline as differing from this. Like I've said before, I do think there's a lot of textual evidence to suggest that the Shattering happened well after the Age of Plenty, and that after the Age of Plenty should be Radagon's period as the Elden Lord, and then after his period as the Elden Lord, Marika got angry due to the Night of the Black Knives and Ranni murdering Godwyn, and then she shattered the Elden Ring, which is what we're told from multiple sources. So I do think he's fundamentally wrong here, and he is trying to kind of work a bit backwards from a conclusion and supporting it, rather than taking evidence, stacking it on top of itself to draw a conclusion based off of that evidence, which is what I try to do. So that's a lot of my issues with this video specifically, and I mentioned it earlier that this has kind of been something that's been building up throughout many of his videos, and I feel like it's taken 15 videos of his for me to get a better understanding of their timeline of events, which is a really long time because there's a lot of information that they've posted that I think should now be reconsidered. But because these videos are not very well self-contained, it's really harder to go back and address those specific points. So, as I said way earlier, one of the things that they mentioned in like their third or fourth video was how they believed the Great Tree, in their opinion, which came before the Erdtree, was based on a coniferous type of tree that you could see in places like Stormvale or in the Round Table Hold. Let's go ahead and pull up one of those depictions. And I might be misremembering exactly what they said, so if I do misrepresent it, I apologize. So I am using my working memory here, so just kind of disclaimers. What do we have? Oops, misspelled it. Oh no, so that's the one he says is the Age of Plenty, so that's like the current Erdtree. Well, not like the current one, but Godfrey's Erdtree. Okay, so this would be a good one. So he would say that this depiction of the tree isn't the Erdtree, that this is a conifer, and it is the Great Tree. However, this is directly contradicted by quite a lot of things, in my opinion, but nothing as clear as the what's it called? The Tree and Beast Surcoat. So the question is, does this tree match up with the depiction of this tree? I would argue it does, and the description of the Tree and Beast Surcoat says, I guess I should pull that up. Okay, nope. Okay. The Tree and Beast Surcoat says, the surcoat depicts the distant Erdtree and the Beast Regent, an emblem of the Golden Lineage. Both are symbols of glory now past. So this tree represents the Erdtree, and that directly contradicts Tarnished Archaeologist saying that this depiction of the tree is the Great Tree specifically, and it's a conifer not analogous to the Erdtree, because in his opinion, this depiction of the tree is actually the Erdtree. So I do think they get a bit confused and want clearer lines of what trees represent the Erdtree, and so because these trees do look kind of like different, he thinks they cannot be the same tree, but we do have textual evidence kind of contradicting that. And so part of the reason why I brought up this tree specifically representing the older style tree is, while this appears on Godric's stuff, which harkens back to a fond nostalgic remembrance of Godfrey's age, I would make the argument that this tree is supposed to be the exact same tree that you'd see on the Leyndell soldiers and even the knights' uniforms. And if he wants to make the claim that the Godfrey stuff is more in line with the ancient Erdtree as he talked about, we do have the Leyndell knights having the more modern Erdtree worship sigil on their armor. So we do have some fundamental incompatibilities with other visual imagery in the game, as well as textual stuff that I don't think the Tarnished Archaeologist considers. And then I do have another image of the knights that I wanted to show off with their Erdtree. Okay. So if this is supposed to be the older version of the Erdtree, why the hell do they have the more modern variant? My argument would be that, as I've said like multiple times throughout this video, that the Erdtree worship still worships the Erdtree, but it's faith-based rather than like quid pro quo where they're getting like the tears and the blessings directly. So sorry to keep beating a dead horse about that. I actually do have more to talk about, believe it or not. Let me see what you guys are saying. Beans and Rice just rewatched the part about the Age of Plenty, and the way he said it kind of seems to imply that he thinks there's more than one shattering. And that's another issue that I have with kind of their script writing. I do wish that it was a little bit tighter and the sentences were a little, like, ran on a little bit less, so that way it's easier to address one point specifically as they make them. Hey, Eric Williams, welcome into the stream. And John Paul Cochran, nice to see you again. Just got in, but you think the different tree designs is just like difference between how some crucifixes are gold-plated and embellished and others are just wood. Yeah, that's a very good comparison to make, and I would definitely agree with that. However, I do think it's unfortunate that the Tarnished Archaeologist has built up a kind of different cosmology based on these depictions here. And so, to go along with that, yeah, there's just a lot of Erdtree depictions that are worth talking about. Oh, yeah. Another big one that I wanted to mention in a video that was like one or two videos before this was that I don't want to talk about like the Banished Knight claim. It'd probably be better to just react to that video directly. But just to give a quick summary, they tried to make the argument that let me just type in banner, that the crimson and gold Erdtree banner represents an older tree than what we get, and it only appears in conjunction with like the Banished Knights or something like that, and it's a different tree than the actual Erdtree that we have. So he was saying that this depiction of the Erdtree is of a more ancient tree, probably the Great Tree, I think is what he was trying to say. However, I do think that gets contradicted with a couple of the other banners that go along with this. So this is in the Round Table Hold, obviously. This is Fia's room, I believe. And then down here, we have the same banners appearing, which isn't that big a deal. However, on the opposite side of the room, we have the Sirach banner. So you could say, oh, Sirach is linked to that banner. Like, why would there be like two different like eras? Because Sirach you could associate with Godfrey. Does this mean that Sirach as the Beast Lord had a different tree before Godfrey and that these things are different? Maybe, but I think even that idea becomes a bit more tenuous when you look at other rooms in the Round Table Hold, like the Twin Maiden Husk room, which has the kind of what he would say more ancient tree design, whereas there is a more robust kind of modern Erdtree where you have the people coming out of it, which I think he would correlate to the Age of Abundance. So I do think there is a repeated pattern of cherry picking his data points and not considering contrary evidence or being unaware of that kind of contrary evidence. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about this video in depth today and give very tangible counter examples to his claims, just to kind of like spread awareness and hopefully help them kind of reformat the way that they've been going about presenting the lore, because I do think it's a bit disingenuous and a little bit harmful to the community as a whole. So that was a lot to talk about. Thanks for sticking with me through that. Thrill, welcome into the stream. You figured the conifer-looking tree was the pre-crucible tree? It had to do with something before it was a stump. Yeah, that's kind of what he argues, but like I said before, that is directly contradicted in the tree and beast surcoat. So, yeah. Alright, yeah. All of you, thank you for sticking with me through that. I paused quite a bit longer than I thought I would. I do have 2 more videos up on the docket for tonight, and so we'll go through those next. So next, we have Elden Ring lore, Melina, an identity crisis by the Ashen Hollow. I will go ahead and link this video from Tarnished Archaeologist into the chat. I am actually going to do something for a first on the stream and actively dislike a video, because I think there are a lot of issues with this one specifically, in that it really misleads players on multiple levels. So, sorry to be such a downer about that. Now we'll go ahead and move on into the Elden Ring lore, Melina, an identity crisis video by the Ashen Hollow.
The enigmatic would-be maiden, burned and bodiless, leads us across the lands between. and inevitably to the mountaintops of the giants, where the flame of ruin awaits to light the Erdtree ablaze. Melina remains at the forefront of mystery, but who is this kindling maiden, or who does she pretend to be?
I have long observed the lands between. This world is in dire need of repair, and death indiscriminate.
Hey there, I'm Jake the Ashen Hollow, and I hope you're doing well. Initially, I wanted to make a video with a single theory on Melina's identity. But after a lot of brain-racking and hair-pulling, I simply couldn't narrow it down to one. I don't believe there is enough of any evidence at the moment to point into a singular direction. And there are several directions that all begin to make a lot of sense in their own ways. So in this video, we'll be going over the different directions Melina's identity can take us. Let's start with some of the things that we do know about Melina.
So yeah, I kind of agree with, was it the Lore Hunter? Ashen Hollow, that there is a bit of an identity crisis with Melina, and there could be multiple ways to read her in the timeline. So I'm curious as to what options he gives us. I have a couple ideas of my own, but I don't want to jump ahead too far yet.
She was born at the foot of the Erdtree, though now she comes to us under the guise of a maiden burned and bodiless. Her purpose was given to her by her mother inside of the Erdtree, and that purpose is to be used as kindling for the flame of ruin to set the Erdtree on fire. The more popular and seemingly most obvious theory is that Melina is in some way a daughter of Queen Marika, via her mother being within the Erdtree giving her purpose. There is an interesting piece of dialogue from Melina, however, that could suggest that Marika isn't her mother in the traditional sense of the word.
Your seamster, Bok. I see him crying from time to time. I think he misses his mother. He wants someone to tell him he's beautiful. Does being born of a mother mean one behaves in such a manner?
This is certainly an interesting revelation, as it implies that Melina wasn't even born at all. What if she was created? Or what if she is Marika? So we know that Marika and Radagon are one and the same, though we don't know how the exact specifics of that work. But we do know that they shared a singular body, at least in the end, as we can watch Marika transition to Radagon. What if
I do appreciate that choice of language there, that they shared a body, at least in the end, because that does leave it more open-ended that they could have been two individuals prior to that. And of course, people's opinions on whether or not they were one body but two people, or two people and one body, can differ. So yeah. Without Horns, welcome into the stream. Nice to see you. You offer me an accord, or wouldst thou prefer fiat? You love Melina? She's so weird. I thought I was going to say something else, but I'm blanking. Hey, Billy Caldwell, welcome to the stream. Alright, yeah, I'm just blanking. Let's go back.
Melina is someone or something similar, except in a way that Marika breaks them off from herself. Marika knew for a while that she would betray the Golden Order. Melina, whose purpose is to burn the Erdtree, could very much be the means to that. It would also explain some of the curiosities of Melina. Consider how the Black Knife assassins were all Numen women that had close ties to Queen Marika. It's obviously not a stretch to think, in regards to their fighting style, that Marika's would be similar.
Alright, so I did like that little bit of the source here. I almost didn't notice it, because like my mic arm is almost in the way, but not really. It's a little bit... I'm going to blame the subtitles, or the closed captions. It's probably a little bit more noticeable. Maybe not, I don't know. But at the very least, if you don't have the text directly, I don't mind these kind of side comment sources.
Were all Numen women that had close ties to Queen Marika. It's obviously not a stretch to think, in regards to their fighting style, that Marika's would be similar. What's interesting is that Melina's dagger, the Blade of Calling, has the exact same weapon art as the Black Knife Assassin's Black Knives.
Yeah, I was going to point that out.
With the exception of the Black Knives being imbued with destined death, of course. And if we...
And it is really strange to me how Melina is imbued with gold. I do kind of wish like it had a lingering effect, like a buff or something, but it's all right.
Choose to summon Melina for the Omen King fight, we'll see that she has an exact same fighting style to the Black Knife assassins found within the game. We also find the Blade of Calling in a room clearly meant to keep someone locked away in. Outside of this room sits a dead guard from whom we receive the official's attire, which speaks of the grim tasks they dutifully carried out.
Cool note is that the official's attire wasn't in there in 1.0, so they did add it in.
Gruesome rituals, executions, surveillance, to name a few, which seems to be in line for sitting guard outside this room, making sure to keep Melina in. She was, after all, the Kindling Maiden, and an integral part of defying the Golden Order, regardless of whether she herself was a piece of Marika or not. So keeping your kindling for burning the Erdtree under guard was probably imperative.
So I don't necessarily know if I would agree with this dude keeping Melina in as much as maybe keeping others out, because this doesn't really give me much of a prison vibe. I mean, it very well could be. Especially with like the iron doors, so maybe there is like the iron bars rather. So maybe there is more of an argument for that. But at the very least, it's kind of funny that if she's burned in bodiless, like how would a door stop her? So maybe this is supposed to be for when she still had her real body, I guess, if she had one. So let's go back.
Golden Order, regardless of whether she herself was a piece of Marika or not. So keeping your kindling for burning the Erdtree under guard was probably imperative. Now, these things could make a compelling case for Melina being a part of Marika, but there is another piece that is left unaccounted for and doesn't quite fit into the previous theory, which I found to be a theme every time I thought I was figuring her out. The enigma here is found in the cutscene for the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending, in which Melina's previously shut eye is opened wide in a shining purple color for all to see.
One thing that I don't see other people bring up, which is a little bit surprising, is how her other eye is dull and lost its golden brilliance, which is pretty much all she has beforehand. So, well, that doesn't necessarily speak to Melina's character. At the very least, it could say that, like, as the Lord of the Frenzied Flame, you may have burned gold away because her right eye is dead.
Opened wide in a shining purple color for all to see. Or perhaps the color is more that akin to gloam, as some would say that this suggests Melina is the gloam-eyed queen, the once leader of the Godskin Apostles, as well as an Empyrean. But I don't think Melina quite fits that bill. However, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that she could be the daughter of the gloam-eyed queen. And the identity of the gloam-eyed queen herself isn't super important when talking about Melina, but her possibly being Melina's mother, who's supposedly within the Erdtree, doesn't mean that the gloam-eyed queen has to be Marika in that regard.
Isn't that fun?
We learn through our travels in the Lands Between that when someone dies, their soul is called back to the Erdtree. So if that's the case, the spirit of anyone who's dead could still be within the Erdtree, as I'm not exactly sure of how their cycle of death and life works.
You know, that's probably a pretty fair theory, depending on how one feels about, like, the tiers of the Erdtree and stuff. So maybe not like everybody, but to just kind of tie into this idea further, I have wondered whether or not the very beginning cutscene when the Tarnished awakens, let me go ahead and pull it up, could be them in the Erdtree up until they get like the they go through like the fog gate or whatever it is. So let's go ahead over here maybe. Let me go ahead and mute that. Did I stop it? Oh, I skipped it on that one. All right, hold on. Intro? I don't remember what I titled it. Oh, maybe it's part of my old footage that I got rid of, which would definitely suck. Oh, wait, no, okay, I should have it. Here we go. So yeah, I've wondered whether or not this is the Erdtree when we wake up.
And one other, whom grace would again bless. A tarnished of no renown.
Because this doesn't look natural or like man-made, whatever you want to call it. It kind of reminds me of
The fog,
where we fight America.
the lands between,
So maybe the Tarnished is stored in the tree.
to stand before the Elden Ring.
Alright. And so, like, when we do go fight America, we kind of have the opposite happen where we step into the light. Well, I guess we kind of step in the light there, but, like, it comes for us here. So, the whole regression thing with the Golden Order, perhaps. It does look like Radigan's Battle Arena. America took the Glowmide Queen's soul and rebirthed it as a young girl. That'd be interesting. Aren't all Tarnished supposed to be outside the lands between when they revived the first time? Yes, there. So, one interesting description comes from the Memory of Grace, and the Japanese differs a little bit. I guess I'll just go ahead and pull it up. Why do I keep closing this? I should know better than to ever close this for the stream. Memory. So, the Memory of Grace says, it's the memory of first grace which once guided bygone Tarnished to the lands between. So the word here, bygone, comes from shiseru in Japanese, which is like a weird present passive way of saying the dead Tarnished. And this isn't like a common way to say dead in a like present progressive sense. So the way that I've wondered this is meant to be taken is that the Tarnished aren't dead, they're actually dying, or rather they're in a state of death, and because they're in death, they can't die because it's an action that will never like come to completion. So that might be related to the Erdtree, because we do have the one rolled finger reader crone who says that destined death is sealed within the Erdtree itself, and that burning the Erdtree will like end the world itself or something along those lines. I almost closed this again. Let me just put it over here. So, what were we even talking about to get to this point? Oh, yeah. So, like, the beginning, or like the beginning cutscene and the Erdtree interior. Alright. Let me back up like 10 seconds just so we could bring his point back up.
So, if that's the case, the spirit of anyone who's dead could still be within the Erdtree. I'm not exactly sure of how their cycle of death and life works. And that could be Melina's mother. The Godskins once served destined death, but after their defeat at the hands of Malekith, their power was sealed away.
So Methoda asks a good question that, isn't there another description that mentions the Tarnished leaving by boat with only one left behind or something? Yes. So that's in the Rusted Anchor, and it is written as hearsay, so it could be like a little bit more wiggle room for Tarnished to exist beyond just the one boat. However, we also have the one description in something related to Godfrey. It might have been Horaloo's remembrance that he left with his kinfolk, but it doesn't necessarily say all kinfolk, which I kind of hate that little bit of wishy-washiness in the text. So anyway, the whole reason why I bring that up is there might have been Tarnished who didn't actually leave the lands between, and those could be Tarnished like Topes, arguably Sullen, because she could get death blighted and frenzied when you at least use her puppet, so maybe her real body wasn't tarnished. Anyway, Topes is definitely tarnished. And then we also have Vike, who was beloved by Landsax, and there is the chance that he left the lands between with all the other Tarnished, but if so, that should mean that the war against the dragons would have happened before Godfrey left the lands between. So nothing like really contradictory. It's just some kind of interesting implications on the timeline, depending how you read certain events. And so, yeah, if Vike was like left behind on the boat, then the war against the dragons could have happened after Godfrey left, I guess, is what I should also say to go along with that. All right, let's back up because I don't remember what he was saying because I got distracted by the chat.
And that could be Melina's mother. The Godskins once served Destined Death, but after their defeat at the hands of Malekith, their power was sealed away. So calling them enemies of the Greater Will and its Golden Order would probably be accurate. Which of course falls back on the idea that Melina's very purpose given to her by her mother is a major step in toppling the Golden Order. If Melina is the daughter of the Glomide Queen, then she is intrinsically linked with death. And when we see her with her eye opened and the mark upon it faded, that is the only time we see her after Destined Death has been released back into the world. Otherwise, she would have already sacrificed herself so that you had the opportunity to do so. So, unbinding death seemingly unbinds her eye. So it's certainly curious in regards to this theory that the beast eye given to us by Malekith to track the death route is a murkier color of Melina's opened eye. And the scratch marks on the beast's eye could possibly line up with the marking upon Melina's eye.
Oh, I never really thought of them as being like scratch marks. I don't think it really works, but yeah, that's a cool idea. Yeah, just to go a bit off beyond that, it is customary for certain beasts to actually have purple or violet eyes. Blythe, if you look into his eyes, they are purple. In the underground areas where you fight the demi-human queens, their eyes can appear purple as well. So it might be a beast thing specifically. And if so, it's a little unfortunate that like most of the other demi-humans don't have purple eyes, I guess. But I don't know. Can we actually even see Malekith's eye? I don't think so. I know in the 1.0 description, in the quick description for it, it said it like came from Malekith himself. And I wanted to check the Japanese on that because I wondered whether it meant it was Malekith's eye or given to us by Malekith himself, if that makes sense. But apparently the English 1.0 text of the game is older than the Japanese 1.0 text in terms of like when it got patched. So the Japanese 1.0 text is pretty much like retail. I don't know if there's any text updates in the Japanese throughout the game's development. I should check that out sometime. It's definitely a tattoo, but maybe of a claw mark. There might be the possibility that what happened to Melina could be like how Marika or Radigan cursed others with their Elden runes to give them a mission that they must fulfill. And if so, could the Glomide Queen have given Melina hers? Is one question you can ask. But we don't really know. Could could Marika have given her this mission? Why is this like symbol on her eye? We don't really know.
On the beast's eye could possibly line up with the marking upon Melina's eye. So being related to the Glomide Queen and linked to death in such a way begins to make sense. Especially considering that burning the Erdtree grants us access to Farum Azula, where we can release death back into the world again, just as the Glomide Queen would want. And could also explain why we find her Godskin duo there to begin with. But that doesn't quite explain why she's held captive in a room in the Leyendell capital, or why she's burned and bodiless, which is again the trend I ran into again and again when trying to make sense of this enigmatic maiden. Melina's being burned and bodiless could allude to an attempt to burn the Erdtree once before, to champion another lord to the Elden throne that ultimately failed. Perhaps Melina was first maiden to another Tarnished, and perhaps this Tarnished was Bernal, who before becoming a recusant, slaughtering his own, was a champion worthy of becoming a lord, until of course his maiden threw herself into the fire.
You know, I never really thought to link Melina to Bernal. That's kind of an interesting theory. I don't know if it really works, but I mean, you could make the argument, how else did he get to Farum Azula before or contemporaneously with us?
What caused Bernal to change his mind isn't super relevant, but it's perhaps the reason Melina could be burned and bodiless, still in search of a Tarnished who will actually take the mantle of Elden Lord.
Oh yeah, and I guess I should say part of the reason why I also don't take it too seriously is because there is the content of Bernal's maiden being completely different from Melina, and of course you can make the argument that cut content is cut for a reason, but at the very least it was not in the developers' minds for quite a long time that Melina should be related to Bernal.
This still doesn't account for everything about Melina, though. What about the seal or mark upon her eye? It looks like it could be considered many different things. I personally believe that it looks a lot like a bird's talon. If the purple eye links Melina to the Glomide Queen and thus to death, perhaps this mark is something to do with the twin bird, who is said to be an envoy of an outer god and the mother of the Deathbirds. So perhaps she's linked to death in that matter. And even before the time of the Erdtree, death was burned in ghost flame, and the Deathbirds were the keepers of that fire. Could that explain her proclivity to use the Flame of Ruin to burn the Erdtree? Or why she has the knowledge of the Flame of Frenzy and her insisting you leave it well enough alone, lest she hunt you down and kill you? Which is totally a Black Knife Assassin thing to say. Could a relation to this twin bird's outer god help solidify her as a daughter of Marika and sister to Melania and Mikola, who have each lived their existence dictated by a different outer god as well? I believe it was Vadi who theorized that perhaps each of the butterflies we find in the game correlates to one of the siblings. The Aeonian butterfly for Melania.
So, I thought about that theory for a while. I kind of just dismissed it a bit offhandedly because I didn't really think there was a lot to substantiate it. Obviously, there is that kind of a symbolism which is striking, and I understand the appeal of that. However, if Melina is supposed to correspond to the, I would say twins, but I guess triplets in this example, then I think it becomes even more difficult to explain the how and why she's burned and bodiless. So I kind of don't take it too seriously because it could have happened after the fact, but it just doesn't seem to work. We also have characters like Gowry, and even Morgott says like the twin prodigies, not like the triplet prodigies. Obviously I don't have like a lot of first-hand experience with this, but I don't think if you had triplet siblings and one of them were to die, would you refer to the remaining two as twins? It's kind of a dark thought. I don't think so. I don't really think that works. But anyway, yeah. Let's go back to the video.
Nascent butterfly for Mikola and the smoldering butterfly for Melina, the kindling maiden. That would pair very nicely with the idea that Melina is also afflicted with something or other from another outer god. The thing is that for as much as something makes sense about Melina, there are other factors about her that work for some theories and not for others, and vice versa. I really wanted to make a video with my surefire theory about who Melina is, and maybe one day I'll feel I have uncovered it, but I simply couldn't do it this time around. And with how many different things that could make sense, I really just wanted to get a dialogue going about her, because I want to keep talking about her so badly. So tell me what you think, and let's try to crack this egg together. And thank you so much for watching. Feel free to subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and follow me on Twitter for reasons. Check out my brand new merch shop for some cool apparel, including this amazing Melania and Mikola merch done by Gen Designs. Join the community Discord and come chat lore with us.
All right, cool. That was a really good, very brief, direct, and to the point video. I enjoyed it quite a bit. It had some bits of speculation that I haven't heard about, which I enjoyed. Obviously, I didn't agree with everything, but nonetheless, I still think it kind of broadens my horizons there. So if you guys enjoyed that video too, go ahead and give him a like. I left the link in the chat. So yeah, that was really good. What was I going to say about that? Oh yeah. I do kind of find it funny that at least I'm not the only person to have struggled so much with the identity of Melina, and it is kind of bittersweet as well to find some companionship in that from other content creators. And obviously, it's not just the content creators who come up with like the lore theories and everything. It's just I've been kind of cloistered away from the community, focusing on my own stuff for so long. So it just I don't know. I can see I don't know. I can see like myself in that struggle there, lacking the words. Stella says there's still triplets even after they die, but triplets can't have two be twins. Oh, okay, so like the fraternal triplet and then the two identical twins, or I guess technically if they share the egg. So one egg of twins and then the other egg of the individual. That would be something. I never thought about that, Stella. Yeah, because that could potentially work if you want to say that Mikkel and Melina are still twins, and Melina is their triplet, but not necessarily the same as the twins. I don't know why that never occurred to me. That's a really good point. You like the idea that Melina is kind of an extension of Marika, the way that Millennia's children are. Yeah, I do think that idea is pretty compelling, but I don't want to put all my chips on the table because I know I know FromSoft is just gonna like screw me if I do, because they'll ignore everyone else's thoughts but screw me specifically. Nah, not really. So some other context about this video that some people might want to know is I know internally Melina is called Marika of Daughter in English, sort of, but as far as I'm aware, that title is kind of like Google Translate tier Japanese into English. And from a post on Twitter that I saw about it, oh wait, I have the pictures on my computer. I can just pull those up. Maybe tweet. No, twit. Okay. Oh, that's why I thought there were two names. So yeah, Sinka or Noof834 made the point that in Japanese, sorry, they made the point that in English, Melina is called Marika of Daughter, like with the C, not that they pointed that part out, and Nebula Dragon is like the Elden Beast. So they pointed out that she's called Marika of Daughter, but it's a little bit different in the Japanese, and if it was the daughter of Marika in Japanese, it should be written this way, Marika no Musume, or like Marika ko, but the way that it's currently written in Japanese is that with the character for like daughter coming before Marika, it's meant more perhaps in the sense of maiden. Like not perhaps, it kind of means like maiden Marika, not necessarily daughter of Marika. And so if Melina is called Maiden Marika, does that mean Marika is Melina? Ooh, even more support for the theory. However, I do kind of hate that we would get that information from secondary sources not present within the game itself. I mean, technically it's present, but I think you all know what I mean by that. Billy Caldwell, are you muted? No? Were you saying stuff? Yeah, if you ever don't see your messages appearing in my on-screen chat, then I guess like Google is losing it in the sauce there. So yeah, she could be young Marika is another way to interpret Melina's character. And do with that information what you will. You're welcome. Alright, so that was a very good video by the Ashen Hollow. Next we have one more by Ziostorm called Elden Ring Lore, The Secrets of the Erdtree. So we've watched a couple other videos by Ziostorm, or maybe only the one on the stream. But anyway, good friend of the channel, so let's go ahead and dive on in.
Alright, what's going on, guys? Throughout the expansive lore of Elden Ring, there are many things that still remain a mystery even this far from release, ranging from baseline questions about characters to fundamental principles about the world that otherwise remain unexplained. And that is, to a degree, the point of the way the story is portrayed in this game, intentionally left obscure so that you ask these questions and ponder what they really mean. But among all of those, one of the most prominent features of the game has remained the biggest mystery to me, and even though it's the most recognizable thing in all of Elden Ring, I can't figure it out, and that is the Erdtree, the golden icon of the lands between, the object of our journey, and the one thing in the lore that should be the most understood. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the lore of the Erdtree and talk about everything we know about it, what doesn't actually make sense, and the questions we still have that will hopefully get answered further in the DLC. So as we get into it today, if you enjoy all things Elden Ring and From Software, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and help the channel climb to 100k. But let's begin with what we know about the Erdtree physically. I want to break it down into three primary components, those being the canopy, the trunk, and the roots, and we'll work top to bottom, as it can be clearly seen pretty much anywhere in the game. The golden light of the Erdtree radiates from the canopy down into the lands between. The branches create a sprawling net that covers pretty much the whole continent, shining down golden beams that don't come from the sun but from the tree itself, now giving the tree the role of the sun. But from that bright canopy, lots of...
To be fair, you can still kind of see the sun in a couple places. Let me just type in sun. I think I have footage. Fair Missoula is not helping me. Okay. Nope. Sunrealm Shield. Okay. So in Liurnia, we definitely have the sun that can set over the ocean. So, well, Ziostorm is right that like light does get radiated from the Erdtree. It's not like there isn't a sun specifically, but there does seem to be an actual like direct correlation between the Erdtree and the sun to some degree because of like the Warming Stone's description, which does say that the Erdtree was once as warm and as radiant as the sun or something like that. Yeah, that was my footage. You don't have much hope for the DLC providing any answers. You can't remember the last time a DLC answered a fraction of the number of questions it raised. In some ways, I do think the Ringed City put an end on the games, but it definitely also raised a lot of questions as well. So it's like the monkey paw curls with each DLC they release, you know?
Golden leaves fall down into the land. Leaves that supposedly tell the story of that land. But the leaves are...
Oh yeah, and that was something I wanted to bring up with the Tarnished Archaeologist video, in that if there is like the whole Phantom Erdtree theory, I wonder how they feel about when Erdtree leaves fall at night and increase our rune generation. To be fair, we do have the Erdleaf flower description, which says it was fed by leaves from the Erdtree in antiquity, implying that it is no longer fed by those leaves. So there might be some actual basis to believe that the Phantom Erdtree isn't exactly real, but it's kind of arguable because you could also say that the Erdleaf flowers were taking the ancient Erdtree's leaves rather than like the current versions, and so yeah. Whether or not you want to say that was a phantom, it's just, you know, wonderfully ambiguous. The leaves in antiquity were just better? Yeah. So a little bit of real life lore. Apparently in like plant biology, the more nitrogen in the air, like the more nutrients leaves and greens tend to have. And in the age of the dinosaurs and whatnot, there was a lot more nitrogen in the atmosphere, and that also helped the dinosaurs get sustained on their diets of like leaves and greens and stuff, because they were just way more nutritious, or so I've been told, or so I've heard. Yeah, lots of nitrogen in the cycle back then. Okay, so at least I'm not the only one that heard it. So yeah, maybe there was more nitrogen in the Erdtree way back when.
Aren't the only things that fall from the branches. Golden seeds can also be found all across the land, tucked away in spots where sprouting Erdtrees grow from the earth. And they have a description that reads, "When the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erdtree, scattering across the various lands as if life itself knew that its end had come." But there's another very interesting fact about these seeds. The Crimson Seed Talisman.
Hey guys, that reminded me of another thing that I wanted to bring up in relation to the Tarnished Archaeologist video. So, he, in one of his earlier videos, not the one that we watched tonight, he brought up the point of some gigantic organisms. That was my computer. It's so weird when it does that. Some, like, trees that are, like, way larger than, like, the singular trunk or root that you'd expect of a normal tree. And so he brought up the parallel of Old Jico existing for like thousands of years and being like a bunch of kind of trees, but one tree, as well as Pando. And I was curious as to why he didn't consider that the minor Erdtrees may not have come from the shattering, but they could have come from the actual roots of the Erdtree and not have been born from seeds themselves. And so you could make the argument that the golden seeds create the quote-unquote illusory Erdtrees, whereas like the minor Erdtrees are actually from the Erdtree's root structure. Who took the golden seed from the Cave of Knowledge entrance? The biggest mystery in the game. It was Vare. You know that jerk did it. Yeah, but it is kind of funny that you do have the sapling down there, but no golden seed. Stella says, or the increase in CO2 making poison ivy grow faster and more irritating chemically, thus those leaves are better to deal with if you ran into them. Huh. Interesting.
Talisman has a description that reads, "The Erdtree was once perfect and eternal, and thus was it believed that the Erdtree seeds could not exist," which appears to suggest that these seeds are a sign of the Erdtree's imperfection, assuring the fact that when the Elden Ring was shattered, so too was the Erdtree. But as we explore the canopy further, we can find one of the first oddities about the Erdtree. Hidden away from the player's view, we can see that the Erdtree consists of many different kinds of branches. Branches of gold, branches of wood, and branches that consist of both. With the strangest observation of the branches being here, where we can see what appears to be the gold growing on the wood, with tendrils crawling and spreading the color. And what this appears to indicate is that the gold is in a gradual process of spreading. Now the reason I believe that that is the case is because the tendrils are coming from the gold and are themselves gold, but also because this type of behavior in the plant kingdom is typically hostile, indicating a competition between a vine and a tree over nutrients, which may explain why the wooden branches that we can see up in the canopy appear to be dead, with no leaves or further branches of their own coming from them. But it is...
That's a very interesting theory, one that I haven't heard, and one that might have strengthened Tarnished Archaeologist's point earlier. One thing that I want to go along with that I've noticed, let me pull up my screenshots, is that in the minor Erdtree church, as well as like a couple of the other minor Erdtrees in general, the minor Erdtree church being the specific one in Lanedell, there are a couple interesting trees to look at. Okay. So this is the minor Erdtree there, and I, of course, meant to bring this up with Tarnished Archaeologist, that I wondered what their take was on this tree kind of being simultaneously wood and simultaneously being gold. That's not the biggest issue here. As you can see, it does have some more of the... Wait, maybe that's the big Erdtree in the background. I was going to say maybe some... No, that's definitely the big Erdtree. It does have like a lot of the very bright gold for its leaves. However, one thing that fascinated me even more than this tree was actually this tree next to it. So if you look at that one... Where's my picture? Let's try this way. Yeah, if you look at this one, we've got the golden style trunk, but this branch structure isn't gold itself. However, this kind of normal looking branch still produces vividly gold leaves. So, I don't exactly know what to make of these theories here. Oh yeah, and then the minor Erdtrees. that I wanted to talk about. We've got a couple. So in the mountaintops, we've got a bunch of like suckers growing out of the burned minor Erdtree. So maybe that's supposed to be what the Erdtree looks like when it's dead and trying to regrow, but it just kind of ultimately failed. And then in Langdell itself, we don't have a burned Erdtree, but we have like a kind of dead one. And the suckers down here look like they're trying to draw from the roots, and they're still producing leaves. But up top, the tree itself is kind of dead. So I don't exactly know what to make of that, especially in relation to Ziostorm's point here. And I'll probably need to think about that one more, to be honest. That line still gets to you. Being eternal shouldn't be something you once were. Being eternal is eternal. Yes. And so this is why I like to make the argument that during the Age of Abundance, death was still part of the Erdtree, and that's why the Erdtree was said to be fleeting, and such is the course of all life. And I do think when Radagon ascended the throne of Elden Lord, he instituted Rhea Lucarian knowledge to quote-unquote understand their grace, and thereby its power was increased to the point that life no longer faded away because they understood life a bit better, or at least life without death. So if you get rid of death, you still have perpetual life, aka eternal life. So I think Radagon's Age of the Golden Order was technically perfect and eternal, and the issue... Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the Gold Mask stuff. And the issue with the Golden Order wasn't the Order itself, it was Marika freaking out about Godwin's death and potentially Deathroot and breaking the Order in the Elden Ring. So the problem was the god of the Golden Order, not necessarily the Golden Order itself, which I bring up quite a bit throughout my streams. Jandy be chillin', welcome in. You started watching a couple hours after I started, so forgive you for the delayed comments on my commentary. When I try to contradict Tarnished Archaeologist with Berry of Gold about 40 minutes in, you think I'm overestimating my position. You don't see any direct contradiction here, as the player character also encounters a mixture of symbols from different eras, and interesting point nonetheless. So I think if you're still in the past, I think that criticism is fine. However, I would still go back into the timeline of events and say that while I do think you can draw on power from previous eras, Radagon using the Barrier of Gold would predate the era that Tarnished Archaeologist is trying to claim would come later, after the Shattering. So Radagon goes to Liurnia before the Shattering, and technically, according to Tarnished Archaeologist's timeline, that should be before the Erdtree got burned and became more a symbol of faith. Because, and the reason why I say that so confidently is because Radagon hadn't married Rennala up to that point, which means Ranni could not have existed to stab Godwin to spark the Shattering. If that makes sense. Alright, Methoda, thanks for sticking around. You have a good one. I should add Dan Creary's Frenzy Flame emote to the server, because Bella would probably have a lot of fun with that one. Got a good point. Maybe eternal more in the sense of conditionally immortal rather than actually forever. Okay, I already touched that one. Alright. Back to Ziostorm.
It's entirely possible that these golden vines are a purely aesthetic choice, as they are hidden from the player's view normally and can't be viewed without mods that allow you to clip out of bounds. But do keep in mind that idea of a competition between plants, because it will come up again. Moving on from the canopy.
So yeah, I really appreciate Ziostorm kind of walking back that idea. Not that I think it's, discredited. And to tie into what he was saying a bit more directly, I do think you could make the argument that it could be Radagon's instantiation of gold kind of trying to take control of the Erdtree from what had existed prior, with Godfrey having a more red tinted hue. But, that's speculation. That's a little bit mental gymnastics to fit an agenda. And there still may have actually been a real tree before the Erdtree. We don't have a lot of textual evidence for it, but we also can't disprove it either, so do with that information what you will.
Pepe will now begin to work our way down to the trunk. And like the branches above, we can see a clear divide between the wood and the gold, both texturized by very thick bark. But when viewed from a distance, we can see that the trunk of the tree is very badly damaged, with massive cracks going all the way up to the top, as if the tree itself was struck by a massive axe. But although these wounds are external, the real culprit came from within. Like we mentioned earlier with the golden seeds, the shattering of the Elden Ring also affected the Erdtree, and we can see the same kinds of crackled crevices appearing on Marika and Radagon with each strike. The Erdtree is the house of the Elden Ring. It harbors the entire state of the lands between within its trunk, and then therefore reflects that outward. But if we take that as the case, then we come to our first major unanswered question. Why are there two different layers of the tree, the wood and the gold? And although there's no explicit answer, we can take a look at some facts. The current shattered state of the Elden Ring is known as the Golden Order, and we know that the Erdtree itself is an outward reflection of the internal state of the Elden Ring, at least when it comes to that outer layer. So this Golden Order is quite literal, projecting and coating the land in gold. And we can see after the confined piece of the Golden Order is re-released, and the state of the runes are changed, that the tree itself comes to reflect that color. It's not just
I like the kind of idea that he's going for with here. I do think you could say that this is arguable that Destined Death is technically part of the Golden Order. In a certain sense, Ziostorm might be right here because Golden, like, it was technically part of the gold. Sorry, it was let me restart. You could say that the Rune of Death was part of the Elden Ring initially, and the Golden Order came into existence when it confined it. So you could, in a certain sense, say that the Rune of Death is inseparable from the Golden Order, but I do think that's a little bit at odds with what we get in the game. And the other thing... Oh, yeah. So why is the exterior of the Erdtree both gold and wood? You could make the argument that since the Elden Ring was shattered, it's not whole, so it's not as though the entirety of the gold was integrated back into the ring, making it perfect like it should have originally been. And so that might be why the wood is exposed, and it should have potentially been completely covered in gold, like you can see with Gold Mask's ending there. And I do 1000% agree with the idea that Marika and Radagon's cracks on their body came from the shattering, and their body kind of houses the Elden Ring, and the Erdtree also houses the Elden Ring. So there is probably meant to be a metaphysical connection between Marika and the Elden Ring, which I do think gets confirmed with all of the endings.
and the state of the runes are changed, that the tree itself comes to reflect that color. It's not just fire. The outer layer of the tree is quite visibly red. But while we're still on the topic of the trunk, we need to talk about some other properties of the tree itself.
And so what Ziostorm said right there, I do think there is probably a kernel of truth to it, and I've wondered whether or not, since I believe Destined Death was actually part of the Erdtree during Godfrey's time, whether or not this burning Erdtree is kind of supposed to be analogous to some degree of Godfrey's time. Maybe it was more contained back then, without the Flame of Ruin actively burning it, because it was the Flame of Ruin was supposed to have been sealed in Marika in Godfrey's time, so maybe it was the red of Destined Death, but it just wasn't on fire. I don't know.
To reflect that color. It's not just fire. The outer layer of the tree is quite visibly red. But while we're still on the topic of the trunk, we need to talk about some other properties of the tree itself, namely the blessings it's able to give, with one of the most prominent being given to Morgott, who bears the title of the Grace Given, and is the staunch defender of the Erdtree. Grace is an interesting thing in the lore of Elden Ring, and though while it's never explicitly stated where it comes from, the Erdtree is a prime candidate. It might have been that Morgott's loyalty to the
I do think Melina says it kind of clearly. Let me pull her dialogue up. Or at the very least, she like hints at it very, very strongly. I do wish this stuff actually loaded faster. I've got too much footage. Where are we at? I think this should work.
This light once shone in the eyes of your tarnished brethren, but now it is all that guides you. Also, I hear you can see them, can't you?
It's this one.
This tiny golden aura is the grace of the Erdtree. This light once shone in the eyes of your tarnished brethren, but now it is all that guides you.
So yeah, she says it's from the Erdtree kind of explicitly there, and of course her information could be mistaken, but I doubt that. I do think it's the most likely scenario.
Comes from. The Erdtree is a prime candidate. It might have been that Morgoth's loyalty to the Erdtree was enough to earn him that blessing of grace. But then again, there are other possibilities, such as echoes of Marika in the intro cutscene suggesting that she was the extender of grace, and then the ever-present Greater Will, who very much could also be that benefactor. We simply don't know for certain, but what we do know is that all of them, Queen Marika, Grace, the Greater Will, and the Erdtree, are all connected to the Elden Ring. And when pieces of the Elden Ring, small runes, are lost or discarded, they take the form of a little illusory golden tree, further reinforcing that idea of the gold of the Erdtree being an outward expression of the Elden Ring. Not to mention that the Elden Beast, who is said to be the Elden Ring itself, is shown alongside that same illusory gold. And that's why I tend to believe that the...
I was hoping he was going to show it off, but one detail about the Elden Beast that I really appreciate is how I believe it has the same pre-existing wound in its like abdomen that corresponds with how Marika was stabbed in the abdomen when she was like crucified here.
Ring itself is shown along.
So it's a little bit hard to see it from this angle. Let's go ahead and look it on up. I should have something. So it's where you go to like visceral the Elden Beast especially. Let's get that visceral footage. Alright, here we go. So yeah, you can totally see it light up, and I think this is supposed to correspond with Marika's wound. That's some of the secret Frenzy Flame lore footage that I collected. Alright. How much space is all that video taking up? Quite a lot. Which is why I have like the non-lore footage on a completely different hard drive.
Alongside that same illusory gold. And that's why I tend to believe that the gold that we can see on the Erdtree now was not always there, and that there's a whole different kind of tree beneath, which is something we will touch on later, but also seems to be something touched on in the DLC teaser, with the Erdtree no longer having that outer golden coat. But that's just...
So yeah, that idea of the gold not always being there, I think can be substantiated with the idea of Erdtree burial, and the Erdtree accepting the dead into its roots, and probably just kind of siphoning their gold, and maybe gaining power as a consequence of that. But I don't want to say that like that's the parasite theory, but there's probably a certain number of parallels and comparisons you can make to that idea.
Just an idea. Another blessing of the Erdtree that we need to talk about was something much more celebrated in a bygone age, and that is the sap of the Erdtree. The description of the amber medallions reads, "The Erdtree's old sap becomes amber, treasured as the most precious of jewels in the age of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord." But a more somber description of the sap is talked about in the Blessed Dew talisman description, which reads, "It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever. But that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time the Erdtree became more an object of faith." So during this age of...
I don't know why, but it just kind of like struck me as being extra funny right now. Just like how many lore videos constantly reference like these 3 or 4 descriptions. But yeah, Skylazy said maybe the Erdtree wasn't gold at first and it sucked all the grace out of dead people. So, super speculation alert. This is my headcanon. Well, not exactly. This is just some thoughts that I've had, is that it might have been possible that the Age of Abundance with Godfrey was taking the power of gold and death and doling it out equally to pretty much all life, which is what said goes on with the Age of the Crucible and all that stuff, like all life being blended together. So if life was going away from the Erdtree, does that mean the Erdtree was running out of life? Maybe. We are told that there is a little bit of Erdtree burial still going on at that time, but I've wondered whether or not the whole necessity of the law of regression was so that the Erdtree could get its gold back to fuel that eternal era of the Golden Order. So maybe it was actually sucking back all the grace that it had like been given out, which might correspond to how America tarnishes and drains the tarnished of their grace, so that way it can potentially sustain the Erdtree. I don't really know. Like I said, that is pretty heavy speculation on my part. Taxes went back up? Yeah. A lot of details can be missed when you're trying to not get shanked by the boss. Oh, ignore the boss. Just try to run away from the damn Elden Stars beams. Yeah, so like we've been told before, like the Erdtree was a more red tinted shade of gold in Godfrey's time, but that shade of gold changed at least later on. Even though it doesn't specify, I think we can make some pretty educated guesses about that.
Plenty, people would collect the sap of the Erdtree and receive its blessings, but after the Age of Godfrey, that sap was nothing more than dried amber and became a collectible. So those practical blessings of the Erdtree are no longer tangible to the inhabitants of the land, but instead held real by the faith of its followers. Perhaps that's why the gold of the tree is so illusory. Which brings us to a very interesting observation about the trunk of the Erdtree seen from a distance. At certain points throughout the game, notably in Stormveil Castle, you can actually see all the way through the Erdtree, as if it was made of yellow tinted glass. However, if you try to view it through binoculars, it becomes opaque. Now, kind of like I said with the vines, this may just be an aesthetic choice or something to do with the rendering, but we even have select concept art where the Erdtree is see-through just like this.
Oh, okay, I didn't know about the concept art, or at least, yeah. I was gonna make the mention that a similar thing happens in Liurnia, and you can totally see the moon through it until you pull out the binoculars, and then you like mentioned the binocular thing.
I'm going to say I have a definite explanation for that, but there is a very interesting theory from Tarnished Archaeologist that I kind of like, where he states that according to the Blessed Dude talisman description that we read earlier, the line that says the Erdtree became more an object of faith should be taken literally, and that the pellucid gold of the Erdtree can only be seen by those with the guidance of grace. And he provides much more evidence to back this up, but perhaps that husk of a tree that I believe is beneath the gold is all the others might see. It's a very interesting idea and definitely got me thinking. But now we
So again, I do think that is contradicted directly with the Finger Reader Crone and Lane Dell, as well as Muriel's comments about it. So let me pull those up. So surely you see it too. The gold that enshrouds the heavens, the great tree which begets the pillars of light. And of course, I think that's ironic as hell, because she doesn't even have eyeballs. So how the hell is she asking if we see it too? Obviously, I think that's a bit of a rhetorical question, and she's not talking on behalf of herself, but on behalf of others. Then Muriel's dialogue. And so, our church holds in view the monuments of both houses, the Erdtree of the capital in the Academy of Raya Lucaria. And like I said, when watching Tarnished Archaeologist's video, Muriel is talking about this in the present tense. He's not saying like that Erdtree was like a relic of the past. And so if he's saying you should be able to see the Erdtree, is he saying that he sees it or that only the Tarnished should see it? I get the feeling that he also sees the Erdtree, and if so, does that mean he has the guidance of grace? Which I think you could essentially take to mean that anybody can see the Erdtree, and so the Golden Rune descriptions and box comments about do you see the Erdtree towering o'er is meant more rhetorically and to connect the idea of runes and the Erdtree a bit more explicitly.
Move on to the part of the Erdtree that has the most loose explanation. Not that we can't understand it, or the game does not provide the information, but like this part of the Erdtree is hidden beneath the earth, so too our understanding of it is shrouded in mystery. We find ourselves at the roots of the Erdtree. Here we can see the entangled giant roots of the Erdtree with their yellow hue, housing an entire subterranean biome. The first observation we need to make about the Erdtree roots is that they run through everywhere in the game, lining the walls of every megastructure and rising to the ground in every biome. Pretty much everything in the game except for Farum Azula leads back to the Erdtree in some capacity, but the roots here tell a story. They tell us about the origin of the Erdtree. The aspect of the Crucible incantations have descriptions that read, "This is a manifestation of the Erdtree's primal vital energies, an aspect of the primordial Crucible, where all life was once blended together." And I believe we can see that depicted in this statue. Firstly, we can notice that this statue has the image of the Erdtree reliefed at its base. We can then see a winding tree trunk rising upward, with many blooming offshoots fighting for the top. But clutched in the subject's hand is one singular bloom, with a body that is way too familiar to the many trees that appear at discarded runes. So
I don't disagree with this theory. I do want to bring up the point that it's a little bit ironic that this Erdtree depiction isn't always consistent with the statue specifically, and you can see it with a bunch of different ones throughout Leyndell. So if you look at the ones in Leyndell proper, I think they might all, maybe not all of them, but a decent number of them have like lions on the base, and they don't necessarily look like Sarash, but I don't think they're meant to symbolize anything specific. Let me see. Should have a screenshot somewhere. Leyndell. Man, I feel blind. Okay. Found it. It just took me a minute. So yeah, we have a little bits of lions on these ones. You can also find like the little shield depiction on some of them. So not the biggest of deals. I just kind of wanted to bring it up that it isn't always the Erdtree which accompanies the symbolism here, but I still do agree that it probably represents the Crucible to some extent. And also, Anya P, welcome to the stream. Or Pianya, sorry.
Body that is way too familiar to the many trees that appear at discarded runes. So I believe what this statue is trying to show is the emergence of the Erdtree from the Crucible, the Erdtree winning over the other sprouts. And this is reinforced visually down in Deeproot Depths, where we can see the husk of the other sprouts growing upward. And even simply walking around the area, you'll notice that not all of the roots are the same kind. Many of them are much older and dead, suggesting that they don't all belong to one tree. But that isn't backed up in any of the textual lore, so do with that interpretation what you will. But one piece of the lore that is very interesting is the description of Siluria's tree, which reads as follows. The primordial form of the Erdtree is close in nature to life itself, and this spear, modeled on its crucible, is imbued with an ancient holy essence. So the primordial crucible of the Erdtree is the crucible of life, and that description leads us to another mysterious part of the roots. At the base of all the catacombs are a convergence of Erdtree roots, where the bodies of the dead are buried and merged with the tree. In a a process known as Erdtree burial, a process seen as a hero's honor in the lands between. It's unclear exactly what happens to the dead after they're buried in the Erdtree, but what is clear is that the roots in the catacombs are of wood and not gold, therefore they are of the original Erdtree. And if the original Erdtree was the crucible of life, perhaps it makes sense that life should return to it. But this goes beyond simply this Erdtree. We can also find all over the lands between minor Erdtrees, adolescent growths from the golden seeds that we discussed earlier. But what we find around these trees is very interesting. At the base of all currently living minor Erdtrees, we can see smashed living jars. And if you investigate the lore of these creatures, you'll know that their purpose is to seek out bodies, fill themselves with those bodies, and then bring them to the base of the minor Erdtrees to be smashed by the Erdtree avatars and offer their bodies as fertilizer for the trees. Which is why
I think that's a little bit contentious. I don't necessarily disagree, but it's just not explicit is all. So it could be possible that with enough time away from the roots of the Erdtree, if a jar was just filled with enough like physical remnant matter of people, it might eventually kind of come to life. Perhaps similarly to the way that like beast blood conglomerations of like bones and blood exist in places like the Writhe-blood ruins, and that idea in general that like life is like there is no death in the lands between anymore, so eventually like the little disparate elements of former life will congeal into something new, perhaps. I don't really know, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Ziostorm is wrong here either. So for what it's worth, we don't have like any active jarmen near the minor Erdtrees, so there does seem to be like a correlation to the minor Erdtrees preventing the jarmen from actually being jarmen and absorbing their life forces. So Jandy B. Chillin said, you see what I mean? That maybe instead of a Christian comparison, it's more of a Yahwehism situation where Yahwistic cults competed for dominance, and the destruction of the temple created a theological crisis that allowed the more faith-based, non-corporeal school of thought to win out. Maybe. I don't have like super strong opinions about that exactly. I just wanted to point out a couple times where TA kind of contradicted himself, but took one reading when it was like convenient to take it, I guess. But yeah.
Why we commonly find the jars wandering around catacombs and graveyards. But as it stands right now chronologically in our story, there's a variable in this process. The decomposition of Erdtree burial is currently disrupted. The cursed body of Godwin was buried at the convergence of the roots, and now spreads the deathroot infection throughout its system, and the souls that travel throughout that system can no longer reach their end. Souls are trapped in purgatory above ground, and reanimated bodies wander the earth in search of an afterlife. Although it's never explicitly stated what waits at the other side of Erdtree burial, and we have no examples because the process is held in stasis. There are a few hints at why this might have been such an honor. The description of the golden rune reads, "Those born at the foot of the Erdtree are blessed." At least that is the enduring belief of the people of the plateau. Now, is this meant to be taken literally? Does the Erdtree birth people like fruit off its branches, or is it just a figure of speech to those that live closer to its radiance? We don't.
So I just noticed he also had the Clean Rat set on, and I think the Ashen Hollow also did, and I almost stopped the video when I saw his set, because like almost anytime I see somebody else rocking the full Clean Rat set, I'm like, is that my footage? Just because that was like what I used on my first playthrough, and I obviously don't think they have my footage because I didn't really upload it except in like a couple of the lore resource videos that I made, but it's not a big deal. I just got distracted by seeing it 2 times in one night.
Plateau. Now, is this meant to be taken literally? Does the Erdtree birth people like fruit off its branches, or is it just a figure of speech to those that live closer to its radiance? We don't know, but after all, it does state that the Erdtree was once the crucible of life, so the idea of it producing life isn't too far-fetched. And besides, we do know of one person who claims to be born inside the Erdtree. There is one other aspect.
Technically, she says at the foot of the Erdtree, and that can be really vague because all of Altus Plateau is said to be at the base of the Erdtree or whatever it is. And For what it's worth, there is also the amber egg that Renala produces. So the Erdtree might not necessarily have to produce people directly, and the amber egg could kind of birth people from the Erdtree, but not like directly. There's like a ton of ambiguity in different ways you can read things like that. Alexander never even says why he wants to be a strong warrior. I mean, what man doesn't want to be a strong warrior? What kind of question is that, Scalisi? You always thought the jar people attacked the minor Erdtrees, but you never saw anything that supported it. That'd been kind of funny, to be honest. Especially with like the kamikaze dudes. What am I most excited for with the DLC? Bosses, visual design, armor sets, weapons, lore? I mean, obviously the lore. I can't wait to be wrong and reevaluate my theories and then kind of put out something a bit more definitive in like the super edited format. So that's kind of why I've transitioned away from making like the more direct videos, just because I'm kind of waiting since we got confirmation of DLC in before Philionor 2.0. Now, I've been saying that for a while. But also, welcome to the stream, Souls Fractal. Need to make a bingo card. You know what? Maybe we actually should. And I'll put Londor on there, unironically, just for the lulz. If like some bingo cards give you a free space, I'm going to give you a dead one.
Of the Erdtree's magic that involves life, or perhaps the legacy of one. Whenever we fell a great champion, we're granted a remembrance, reflections of the fight used to receive power from the Finger Raiders. But what's interesting about these remembrances is that they all bear the tagline, hewn into the Erdtree, suggesting that the Erdtree still stores their memory. This concept of Erdtree memory is never explored within the lore. It's not touched upon outside that one line, but I do believe it's very relevant, and can be used to explore some other mysteries in the game, one of which we've discussed several times here on the channel, but that'll be a video coming out soon. When it comes to the Erdtree, there's really nothing in this game that it does not touch. It is...
Alright, so what he just mentioned here with the relation of remembrances, he's kind of right where it's only really mentioned directly like that within the context of the remembrances. However, there is some incidental circumstantial lore that ties into it with literally every single weapon art or ash of war that we have, and even kind of spirit ashes to some degree. I do talk about that a lot in my gold and silver video, in that gold is kind of tied to memory and willpower, and soulless demigods have no spirits, but I do think it's possible they have their latent gold within them. And so if we think of the Erdtree kind of like the Yggdrasil, and the way that the Norns, I believe, or the Fates would scribe into the bark of the tree like the lives of people and their deaths. So if you take that idea and kind of apply it to the Erdtree of carving the memory of a being into its bark, if you took gold and put it over that carving, you would get the shape of the thing that it came from, and that might be like what the remembrance is. So maybe you take the gold of the soulless demigods that's left within their bodies and press it into a mold, which allows you to get the remembrances to create like literal weapons and spells and stuff. But again, pretty big speculation, even though I didn't set that up as speculation. But the part about that which is not speculation is that memories are stored within armor and equipment, and ashes of war specifically. And one of the interesting things about that is the non-unique weapons can take on extra ashes of war and gain memories of skills that were used long ago, whereas the unique ones, I would argue, still actually have memories of those skills, and they can't take on further memories, and they're filled. So I think that's why golden smithing stones? Yeah, golden smithing stones work on the generic weapons, and somber smithing stones, which have been drained of gold, work on weapons that still retain their memories, because too much gold would interfere with those memories and then you couldn't use it anymore. That's a little bit headcanon on my part, but I do think that's fairly acceptable speculation, if I do say so myself.
Is in essence the most important aspect of the world our game is set in. There are numerous other concepts relating to the Erdtree that we could explore, but like its roots, that's a discussion that will probably never end. But even though we're still left with just as many questions as answers, I hope I was able to help you understand the Erdtree at least a little bit. But since we know the Erdtree is going to be one of the main factors in the DLC, I wanted to make sure and touch on all the fundamental principles of the Erdtree itself before we get more information, so that we can go into speculating about it with the most knowledge. Either way though guys, that's going to pretty much do it for the video today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like on it and let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. We got Summer Games Fest coming up, so a lot of gaming news that's going to be happening. You're going to want to be subscribed to the channel, so make sure you do that, and with all that, I will catch you in the next one.
Oh, oops. Here I was just trying to get out of the full screen. Why is it not going back? It's annoying. Oh, it's a new tab. That explains it. So yeah, that was a really enjoyable video. Some speculation that I haven't heard of before, especially with like the, I don't want to say like the vines, but like the gold in the upper branches of the Erdtree. I'll need to look into that one more myself. So here's the link to Ziostorm's video here. Popped it up into the chat. And yeah, that'll be it for tonight's stream. I think tomorrow we'll look into more things relating to alchemy with Max the Rat talking about alchemy in Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and then maybe we'll cap things off with Crunchy after that, and maybe an extra video if we have time after that. So once again, thank you for dropping in, whether you've been active in the chat and commenting or if you've just been lurking. I appreciate it. We will be going live again at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. So take care. Hope to see you again. Last Protagonist out.